Okay, listen the fuck up, fam. World discussion time. That means we talk about current events, we talk about world history, we talk about what may or may not happen in the world based on the actors on the world stage. We try to keep it as unbiased and non-partial as we can. Just talk about what's going on. You can pass judgment for yourself. We trust you to be smart and figure that shit out. And without further ado, let's talk to Mr. Agent Smith. Agent Smith.
Hello.
What's up, dude?
Hey. Not much. How are you?
Pretty awesome. We just had a really spicy game.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. It's against the guy who's notorious for always, like, throwing shit on the floor and talking smack and saying that I'm bad and whatnot, which just makes for really exciting things for the community.
Is that pretty normal for the internet?
Yeah, I would say there's a level of showmanship that makes this a little bit more intense than some other stuff. Because a lot of times someone will kind of begin a match against you, they try their best, and then if they lose, they say, alright, you beat me, and then you move on to the next thing. Versus the sort of hard stance where you never admit that you've actually been beaten, and that it was always a circumstantial thing of, well, this was in your favor, but I'm still better and smarter than you, kind of a thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
People really care so much, don't they?
Yeah.
They invest so much in their identities.
Yeah, but if you think about it in terms of the state of nature, right, our perspective is our self, and the value of the self in the community for some people is the absolute most important thing. Like the way that others perceive them. So anything that could threaten that is something that they could maybe be defensive about. As opposed to, I think it, for me, it gives me a sense of kind of relaxation to just admit the truth. Like, if this player is better than me, then I'll just tell my chat, yep, he's beaten me 4 times in a row because he's a better player for these reasons, and I'm trying to work on getting better, but yeah, for now, I will admit I am not the better player here.
Yeah, that's a good attitude to take.
Well, there are some benefits, like, you know how some people watch NASCAR for the cars driving fast, and some people watch NASCAR for the cars crashing.
Yeah.
So we've got that demand in the market. But yeah, it's been a good week so far. Business mostly as usual. We're kind of stable after doing the 24-hour stream and whatnot. Gotcha. So what's been going on in the world? What's the big stuff?
So the big thing from the past week that I picked on was FIRRMA, which I think was a rider to a defense budget bill that was passed. And FIRRMA basically expands the power of the CFIUS, which is the Committee of Foreign Investment to the United States. And it's the congressional body that's responsible for regulating the export of certain sensitive technologies, usually weapons, outside the United States to foreign buyers. And historically, it's been a relatively weak institution. It was just more meant to roughly make sure that nobody was selling weapons to U.S. enemies. So there was basically a license regime in which certain classes of goods that were pretty specifically defined, you know, weapons and things like that. If you made those goods, whatever they may have been, you were required to get a license from the government in order to sell to certain, well, basically to sell it all to buyers outside the United States, and then only to certain designated buyers, basically U.S. allies for the most part. So that's the way it worked for a really long time. If somebody has a stronger background in that, please do kind of elaborate or correct me there. You know, I welcome input. Usual disclaimer: I'm not an expert in everything we talk about on here. You know, some things I have a stronger background in than others. So, chat is definitely encouraged to jump in and participate if I say something wrong or biased or what have you. So please do contribute in that regard. But basically, that's my impression of how it's been working. And then with FIRRMA, they've greatly expanded the scope of the CIFI-US's powers. So the new regime is based on broad classes of companies, what they call quote-unquote critical technology companies. And so rather than focusing on the specific goods and services that are being produced, mostly goods, they're expanding their remit to the actual companies themselves. And that's a big change in and of itself, because, you know, if you have a license, then you feel pretty confident that you can go ahead and do whatever, you know, carry out your business as usual. But if there's more ambiguity about whether or not you need approval from the CFI-US, that creates risk in the business environment that's not really good for market actors. So this is a big reach for the CFI-US, a big change for them. We'll talk about the justification for it here in a minute. I'm not saying it's entirely unjustified, but I'm just trying to elaborate what it is to start with. So there are quote-unquote critical tech companies, and you know, just what constitutes a critical technology company is a little bit ambiguous. Basically, it's companies that produce certain technologies that are thought by the CFI-US to be critical, strategic, or to have dual use. If you don't know what dual use means, that basically refers to a technology that can be used for military purposes, but can also be used for civilian purposes, and is in fact probably intended more for civilian purposes. Those are dual use technologies. So the CFI-US is trying to home in on those and try to restrict companies' ability to just kind of go out and sell, specifically to China. That's kind of more the crux of the problem. There's a fear that dual-use technologies in particular are being targeted by the Chinese government and by certain economic actors, you know, generally Chinese companies that are affiliated in some way with the Chinese government, to acquire those technologies in order to improve the capacity and capability of the PLA, the Chinese military. And so this is, the change is moving beyond a license. The shift is from a license agreement to a broad requirement for CFI-US approval for any deal that could result in the transfer of technology to another firm or economic entity that is affiliated with a foreign actor. And if that sounds complicated, it's because it is. It is a bit complicated. It is a bit ambiguous and complex. The definition of a foreign-owned entity could be a company that has as little as 9% foreign ownership, and maybe even less, depending on the discretion of the CFI-US. And given that a lot of firms in the tech sector don't always know, you know, exactly what the ownership structure of their partners is, or what the ownership structure of their clients is, it's a pretty tall ask to demand that they only sell to firms that are, well, to require that they have CFI-US permission to sell to those firms, because they don't always know whether or not they would need CFI-US approval for a given firm that they're working with. So this is a big change for a lot of tech companies. This creates a lot of red tape for them that did not exist before. Another unprecedented aspect of FIRRMA, the new law, is that it extends the clearance regime, basically the requirement for CFI-US approval, to the domestic sphere. So it's not just a matter of requiring approval for sales to foreign governments or foreign companies. It also extends to companies in the US that you sell to who might be partly owned by a foreign actor. So even if it's a US company you're selling to, if they have a certain percentage that's owned by, say, the Chinese government or Chinese economic actors, that could trigger the CFI-US requirement. And so that also is a new development. You know, before it was not strictly the remit of the CFI-US to regulate exchanges between U.S. producers and foreign producers. But for the most part, it had been. But this extends that remit broadly. This is almost overreach. I'll get to that in a minute. But basically, this is an example of the government really putting its hand into the private sector. A great deal more than it usually does, especially for the United States. It's very unusual in that regard. A few other tidbits, some minor aspects of the bill. It also expands the scope of the CFI-US to deals that involve or that could impact personal data and cybersecurity in the US. And again, that's very broadly defined, so that's also another big expansion of the should call it something else. It's hard to say CFI-US. What would you call it? It's not an agency, is it? It's a committee. Let's call it the committee, for short. So the committee also can review deals, even if it just might impact personal data and cybersecurity in the U.S., even if there's not necessarily a foreign buyer involved, although there probably would be if they were interested. The Commerce Department is required to publish a biannual report on Chinese investment in the U.S., so that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. That could be a tool of the government just to malign investment, but if it's objectively done, then it could be a useful barometer to review and measure Chinese investment in the U.S., because right now I don't know that there's a whole lot of actors in the analytical community, so to speak, who really design broad, all-encompassing reports that can kind of look at that from the top down. So I'll be interested to kind of take a look at that when they start making it. The president is authorized to, quote-unquote, proportional action in foreign cyberspace in response to cyber attacks believed to have been launched from rival states. So that's not a law per se, that's not a requirement, that just sort of, in general, gives the executive branch, and the president in particular, the discretionary power to, if he sees fit, to use a retaliatory cyber attack in order to respond to a perceived cyber attack of one sort or another, and to try to use that as deterrence against future such cyber attacks. There's a whole conversation there about the efficacy of deterrence in cybersecurity, but that's kind of beyond the scope of what I'm trying to focus on here, which is the committee. So moving on from that, the committee will now be able to pursue investment reviews unilaterally. It used to be, and I believe this is the case, that the committee could only review deals that were referred to it by the executive, by the president, basically. Whereas now they'll have the power to investigate and review pretty much any deal they want, so long as it falls within the rubric of their mandate. So, in general, this is a huge expansion of the committee's power. It really hadn't been this powerful before. And there's a real question here whether this is too much power, whether there's just too much discretionary power being given to an organ of the government to kind of interfere in the business dealings of private sector organizations. It's also kind of debatable whether it's really effective in doing what it's meant to do, because the tech sector is inherently amorphous. I mean, they deal in intellectual property, which is sort of an abstract economic good, so to speak. So it's not really something you can kind of put in a box or lock in a safe and try to protect it from malign foreign actors trying to gain access to it. The market is inherently fluid. There's a lot of cooperation and partnerships and coordination among lots of different economic actors within the tech sector, among different professionals and companies and whatnot. So it seems relatively unlikely that you'll be able to really kind of put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak, that you'll really be able to control the flow of information such that a foreign rival like China would not be able to get that information one way or the other, whether by investment or corporate espionage or what have you. They're probably going to get it, almost certainly, sooner or later. So those are some criticisms of the law. the defense of the law, the justification for it, kind of like what I was just talking about a little bit earlier, is that there are a lot of technologies that have dual use that the Chinese government and specifically the Chinese military is interested in. And there are Chinese firms that are not necessarily directed by the party, the Communist Party of China, to get into that sector in order to get access to that technology. But there is a great suspicion that there's a lot of government influence behind Chinese investment in the American tech sector. And for that reason, there's a sense that the government should be doing more to try to preserve the technological advantage the US military has over the Chinese military in order to ensure that the United States and the United States military has a strategic advantage vis-a-vis China in the East Asia. So there is a sense that it's justified on those grounds, basically national security grounds. The government should be doing more in order to try to protect the national interest and protect the intellectual property being produced by the tech sector here that could potentially in the future come back to haunt the United States if the Chinese government were able to utilize it against the United States at some point. Trying to read my notes here. Basically, another argument against, because roughly I've outlined, the pros and cons and roughly what the bill is. But one of the things I don't think the government is really accounting for is the market forces in general. If you make it harder to do business in the United States, it's relatively more likely for those actors to just leave. They don't have to do what they do here in California or San Jose. It's a fluid market, so you could just as easily, draw up software or analyze big data in Singapore or anywhere. Basically, it's not a spatial industry. It's done in the cloud almost. You can do it anywhere. So on the one hand, yes, there are certain advantages to being in the United States. There's access to venture capital. You don't have to go through as many hoops in terms of dealing with another nation's laws and regulations and whatnot if you just do everything in the U.S. But on the other hand, if you are very inconvenienced by the disruptions that are probably going to be caused by this bill, then it stands to reason that you could leave. I mean, you could just easily relocate. So, I mean, it's like trying to borrow a phrase from a famous book on counterinsurgency. It's a bit like trying to eat soup with a knife. You can't really quite do it. You might get some, but for the most part, you're just disrupting the soup, so to speak. So I'm a bit critical, but of course it comes down to personal opinion. Whether or not it's justified or not depends on one's own reading of the threat from China and the need to try to control technology transfers to China that could be abused later or utilized later against the United States. Full disclosure, I'm very tired, so if I'm more incoherent than usual, that's why. I'm recovering from a 4X bender last night. I was playing Stellaris up until much too late, so I'm a little sleepy, to put it mildly. Well, was there anything...
Was there anything what?
Was there anything else, anything that caught your eye the past week, Neuro?
Well, there's always Mueller. That investigation stuff, which we've talked about kind of ad nauseum. I would guess that it would probably be the same thing as last week, that you would say of, yep, there's been some steps, but we don't know how it's going to pan out. And I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that same answer, pretty much.
Okay.
There's been more traction on the investigation. It is kind of it's not reaching a crescendo, per se, but, it is kind of moving in that direction. They are getting more people to kind of go on the witness stand to, what's the word I want? I'm blanking out. Testify, that's it. There are people willing to testify, but what they're going to testify about and how incriminating it really is and whether it's enough for a court case. Subjective, who knows? It's a lot of uncertainty. It's more circus than process at this point. That's not to say the investigation is not warranted or necessary, but there's only so much you can do with something like that. So yeah, I would pretty much refer to my answer from last week in that regard. And I don't remember this person's name, but there was somebody last week who was calling me out on getting impeachment wrong. Impeachment apparently actually is a court case. It is an actual process, so it's not as though Congress just votes on whether or not to remove you. Impeachment is the process of having the case where they judge the president and whether or not he's guilty of given crimes. So thank you for correcting me on that. Again, don't remember the name, but if you're listening, thank you very much. You know, I love reading chat after the fact. I don't read it while we do this, but you know, I frequently learn quite a bit myself reading through the comments, and so I really appreciate that. I like having that conversation with people listening. I think what I was trying and failing to say last week is that, and I read this later after the fact, when I was trying to figure out what the hell I was trying to say. Basically, one of the things that Congress can impeach the president for is basically high crimes and misdemeanors. But the thing is, what constitutes a high crime and misdemeanor is left somewhat ambiguous in the law. And again, my understanding of this is not complete. I'm not a lawyer, so this is well outside my wheelhouse. I would definitely welcome input on this. But my impression was that high crimes and misdemeanors are not really well defined in the impeachment laws and the relevant laws about impeachment. And so Congress basically, hypothetically, because I don't think this has really been tried yet, but hypothetically Congress can define high crime and misdemeanor however it wants, which means that it could basically just subjectively impeach the president for whatever bullshit they wanted. So I think that's what I was trying to refer to last week. I would welcome the input of more knowledgeable voices on that. But I think the point still stands, with the overarching point, which is that Congress can remove a president, not at will, per se, but it's not as airtight and objective a process as it might be. So let's see. Oh, I think we talked a bit about Turkey last week. Mm-hmm. And there was some traction on that over the past week. Basically, we talked about the Turkish economy and how it was kind of struggling because its currency was devaluing and how it was struggling with inflation. So I was a bit curious to see what the big plan was. The Turkish government had released a statement that to the effect of that they were going to try to deal with the crisis. And so the action they took was somewhat effective. I don't think it's going to arrest the crisis, but I think it was actually a bit of creative policy making. They implemented tariffs, specifically targeting certain goods from the United States. The only real important one was cars. They put 120% tariff on the import of U.S. cars. And because that's, you know, I didn't check, but I imagine that's, of the items that had tariffs placed on them, cars is probably the only one that was really significant. There was also alcoholic drinks, leaf tobacco, cosmetics, coal, and rice. And I don't think the U.S. really exports a whole lot of those things to Turkey. So I don't really think those tariffs would really have a big impact on the Turkish currency. But there are a lot of cars. So that, by restricting those imports, that helped the Turkish currency. That helped bump it a bit and helped somewhat arrest the slide in the currency's value. And the creative bit is basically calling them retaliatory tariffs, because the United States had already implemented the steel and aluminum tariffs and had hiked them in the prelude to the whole pastor crisis, which we also talked about last week. I don't even really think it's a crisis, but issue, let's call it. And the Turkish government then cited that as grounds for retaliatory tariffs, which means they're basically legal. Hypothetically, the U.S. could have gone to the WTO and made a case or something, but you know, technically it is legal when it is retaliatory like that. And so they were able to kind of put a dent in the slide in the currency, basically. It's not going to help the Turkish economy. it's not really great to, I mean, obviously it doesn't hurt them too much not to have access to US cars, since I don't think a lot of those are produced in Turkey. And I noted that the goods that had tariffs applied to them did not include intermediate goods. And that's important because a good chunk of the Turkish economy is propped up, is boosted by being a part of supply chains in Europe. So they don't really make cars in Turkey, but they do make a lot of parts for cars in Turkey that they sell to European producers. And so that's an important part of that automotive supply chain in Europe. So none of those goods were targeted. And I'm sure some of them would have been US. Certainly, at least some of them are US, but not even those US goods were targeted. So Turkey kind of protecting its industries while targeting specifically the finished good, cars, in an effort to, on the one hand, arrest the slide and at the same time try to avoid hurting its economy too much. But just having cars be generally more expensive in Turkey, which is going to be the net result, even if the tariff only targets the US, all cars will be relatively more expensive because there's relatively less competition, which is the de facto, outcome of levying tariffs on a good like that. So consumers are going to take a little bit of a hit on that in Turkey. But for the moment, though, they'll probably appreciate that their savings are not losing 5–10% every week like they kind of had been. We'll see what happens. I don't think it's going to. I don't think the Turkish economy, like I said, I don't think the Turkish economy slide is going to end anytime soon. But they at least bought themselves some time. I'm a bit curious to see what the U.S. government has planned, because I hadn't really invested much in that. Maybe invest is not the word. I hadn't really thought much of that issue about the pastor. I kind of interpreted a lot of the talk coming from the White House as being cheap talk. But they have kind of followed it up with an escalating series of measures. Thus far, it hasn't been anything too major. Maybe they have something planned in the future. But for now, it's still not really serious enough for me to think that it's a major crisis in Turco-American relations. We'll see. It does seem to be reaching a kind of personal level of enmity between the two, between Erdogan and Trump. And if it does take on a more personal hue rather than a strategic disagreement about interests between the U.S. and Turkey, then who knows where it could go. I mean, the whole issue could easily fly off the handle. Egos tend to be a lot more fragile than national interests. And as such, issues that are based on ego tend to explode much more readily. So keep an eye on that. I just thought that one little move by Turkey in the conflict was pretty interesting. Some effect, not a huge thing, but I thought it was clever. It's the kind of creative policy making that you wish you saw more of. There was more outside the box thinking, more kind of asymmetrical approaches to problems. Anywho, I think we did have some questions.
Fuzzy Cord on deck.
Yes, thank you again, Fuzzy Cord. Are U.S. and Chinese interests incompatible? No, not really. Because both U.S. and China have an interest in maintaining the economic relationship. Both of them have an interest in, benefiting from the other's foreign trade. And, most of the issues in the relationship, such as they are sort of artificial. The South China Seas dispute is, there's an argument on both sides there, because the Chinese can say with some credibility that it's a long-running territorial dispute. They're settling it somewhat unilaterally, so that would be the kind of counterpoint, but, there is an argument there to be made. So that is, from the Chinese perspective, more of a regional issue, and if not a domestic issue. We can get into that if somebody wants to, because that's a whole other thing. But it's not really a big threat to the United States, per se. It's none of those countries are going to fight over those islands, I don't think. I would be very skeptical of that notion. And I know that people say that there's, X amount of trade flows through the South China Seas, some huge amount of international trade moves through there, but I mean, that was always going to be in danger if there were a conflict, even if China were not in the South China Seas, or more accurately, did not have the islands in the South China Seas. So I'm not terribly impressed by the argument that, you know, they're a threat to international trade. A lot of that trade, if not most of it, goes to China anyway. So that's not as though they couldn't significantly damage international trade just by cutting it off from mainland China. Obviously, that would hurt them too, but hypothetically, that's what they could do. So just the strategic differences are a little superficial. A lot of it just comes down to the ambitions of the Chinese government and the paranoia of the U.S. government. You know, the U.S. is afraid that Chinese ambitions are very wide and broad and that they're going to do something really crazy and risky at some point that could precipitate a conflict. The Chinese, for their part, don't, well, it's a little hard to say what the Chinese want to do because, of course, party politics in China are opaque, to put it mildly. But their big concern is that the United States is going to go out of their way to basically contain China and take actions that slowly strangle China's economy over time, at strategic points in time. Maybe not all at once, but just kind of very slowly building up pressure, tightening the strategic noose, such as it were. That's a reading. Again, who knows what the party really thinks. You know, it could go any which way. But in general, there's a lot of fear, basically, that defines the nominal contest between China and the United States. I think most of the tension is more economic than it is really military. I don't think there's really a whole lot of substance to the military threat posed by China to the United States.
We've talked before, though, about the principle of this island is ours. Mm-hmm. And how, if you're sufficiently nationalist enough, you can take that really far.
Oh, yeah.
Even if it's a totally pointless island. If it's contested, it's almost kind of like, because it's contested, therefore it must be valuable.
Oh, yeah.
Therefore we must defend it.
Nationalists, for sure, take that perspective. You know, it's sacred soil. We have to defend it. We cannot let 1 inch fall to our ambiguously defined enemies. You know, it's that kind of attitude. It's that sort of very tribal perspective, and it has its uses at times. It's not as though it's just innately backwards. I mean, there is reason that exists. But I think in the case of the South China Sea dispute, it's taken to extremes. I mean, a lot of these really are just rocks in the ocean. They have very little innate value, even if you account for the ostensible gas reserves under the ocean around the island.
Rock in the ocean, and you should never forget that.
Well, that's the problem in a nutshell. I mean, most of the countries in the region don't have the power to really challenge China, such that they could entertain such nationalist fantasies. I'm sure plenty of nationalists in the Philippines or Vietnam or what have you would like to go all out and really fight for the islands to some degree, if not directly, then at least indirectly. But they just don't have the capacity, they don't have the means to do so. The Chinese military is too big. On China's part, they have a different issue, which is that there's this weird, ambiguous relationship between the Communist Party of China and the Chinese military. For those who don't know, China doesn't have a military. At least not really. What China has is a huge militia. Now, this is technically speaking. Obviously, China has a military, but organizationally, technically speaking, the Chinese military is actually the militia arm of the Communist Party of China. So it actually is the party's military and not really China's military per se. It's not really controlled by the national government directly. And the chain of command is a little bit weird. You know, there's a committee on top of the PLA, the Chinese military, and I forget what it's called. But basically, half of it is party officials and the other half is high-ranking officers. I believe that was the case anyway before Xi Jinping started to kind of really push hard to take control of it. One of the little arrangements, one of the little norms in Chinese politics that was established in the roughly 1980s is that when a paramount leader, which is basically the main leader of China, when the paramount leader steps down and there's a transition of power to the next paramount leader, the new paramount leader becomes, I believe, president and is the head of the party, the premier of the party. and then the previous paramount leader becomes the chair of that military party committee that heads the military. And so that was meant to act as a kind of insurance policy for the previous outgoing paramount leader against any shenanigans by the new paramount leader. You know, Chinese politics is very cutthroat. There's not really any real rules or institutional norms. Well, we're talking about a norm, so obviously there were some norms, but institutional rules, let's put it like that. So it's very cutthroat, it's very Hobbesian, it's very difficult to really feel secure in that kind of environment if you're on the top of the pyramid, because you never know who's sharpening their knives for you. You never know who's plotting against you. So if you can control the military, or at least technically be on, in command of that committee that controls the military, that gives you a little insurance policy, because then if somebody in the party or the government tries something, you can sick the military on them, which is very intimidating, because the military is very big in China. Obviously, it does what it's told. Tiananmen Square being the case in point. So you don't want to mess with that. So nominally, that was the arrangement. And Xi Jinping basically blew that up. Nominally, Hu Jintao should be sitting as the chair of that committee right now, but guess who's sitting on it now? Xi Jinping. So he's centralized most of the major political positions in China like that under him, either him specifically or one of his loyal people, somebody loyal to him in the party. So that relationship is a little bit ambiguous, so I can't, nobody can really say for certain just how much power then the party really has over the military, because obviously it's something of a separate institution. In fact, Mao Zedong had intended for it to be a separate institution. It was meant to kind of be a check on the party, a way of making sure the party never really lost touch with the people and became, well, basically what it ended up becoming, if not under Mao himself. But nominally, that was the idea. It was its own institution, and it had its own responsibilities in the overarching Chinese political environment. So hypothetically, the Chinese military could do something on its own that is batshit crazy and precipitates a crisis, but on the other hand, there's Xi Jinping. He's gone very far out of his way to ensure party control over the military. Obviously, if you're a politician, it's very important that the military be loyal to you, because they have the guns, and if they decide to shoot you and take power, not a lot you can do about it. A lot of examples like that in places like Africa, the Middle East, what have you, if not also Latin America. So Xi Jinping could act as a brake on independent action by the PLA. He could sit on that committee, and with his power and the power of the people that he's appointed there that are loyal to him, prevent the military from exerting too much influence, too much independent thinking, and staying loyal to the party. As such, it could be that Xi Jinping and the party apparatus can act as a brake on the nationalist impulses of the military, because military people in China are like military people everywhere. They tend to be more gung-ho, more nationalist, more risk-tolerant. They tend to be more desirable of, not conflict per se, but forceful action. They want to send a message. That's generally what they say. We need to send a message to the other guy. So that kind of thinking tends to lend itself to confrontation that itself can then explode later on. But Xi Jinping, being a politician, is more reserved than that. Politicians in general, especially in China, are very risk-averse, especially in Chinese political culture. So that could be the thing that stops serious conflict from happening. Risk-averse Chinese politicians, as we've talked about before, are a lot more concerned about things going on in China, managing the economy in China, managing the political situation in China. No small feat, because again, it's 1+ billion people. It's very difficult to manage 10 people in a room trying to order a pizza, as I've said before over and over again, let alone 1 billion people. So managing China takes up all of the party's time. They really don't want foreign policy kind of adding to their troubles. So there's a great aversion there to doing too much. Obviously, Xi Jinping has expressed a desire for China to be relatively more assertive, but a lot of that has manifested in economic policy, loans, the Asian Development Bank, the other, oh God, I don't even remember what it was, the China something bank. Basically these big IMF-style banks that are meant to help countries develop while also giving some nice opportunities for certain Chinese companies, that kind of arrangement. pretty workable if you're a developing country, easy money. That's something else we could talk about, the veracity of those lending programs, but I'm already several tangents removed from the original question, so let me try to bring it full circle there. The original question was, are U.S. and Chinese interests compatible? Basically what I was trying to say there, the summary of all that is that, yes, they are compatible. The economic ties are strong. There's a good economic incentive to maintain that relationship. Economic tensions regarding technology transfers, perceptions of unfair play in China, of China, so to speak. Those kind of color the tensions right now. The strategic differences, meh. I mean, there's definitely reasons for those tensions, and there's reasons for concern, and the United States probably should, in its own interest, compete with China for influence in the region. You know, again, that's its own conversation. We can get into that. But the fundamentals of that tension, of the strategic, non-economic side of the tension, are just not that strong. You know, again, most of the competition is going to be economic. It's not going to be China slowly using salami tactics to seize every rock, every meaningless rock in the Pacific Ocean. I don't think that's how it's going to play out.
1 second, what the hell is salami tactics?
Salami tactics. So basically, that's like if you want to conquer a territory, one way is to go all in. You build up your army and then you just dump it on them. Just broad, go get them. Another thing you can do is just to conquer a little bit at a time. You don't go all in all at once, you just take a little bit here. You say, okay, we have a pretext, and based on this pretext, we think we need this bit of territory. Not all of it, we just want this bit. So then the other guy says, all right, I don't like that, but I don't think doing something about it is risk the cost that would be incurred of confronting you over such a small piece of territory. So then you do that over and over again, because you know the other guy is never going to escalate. So long as the territory you're taking is small, it's never going to be worth it for them. And eventually you get the whole thing over time.
Right.
There was a great fear that the Soviets were trying to do that in the Cold War by spreading communism, that they were proselytizing communism amongst the developing world, many of which were getting independent for the first time, independent from various European empires. And there was a sense that communist parties were controlled from Moscow, that they were just the vanguard of the Soviet Union, and that basically the Soviets were creating a Soviet empire comprised of all these different communist parties and communist countries, communist-controlled countries. That's a whole debate in and of itself that turned out to be a little bit overwrought, but there was reason to fear in the early Cold War. If you want an example of that actually happening, then of course, the classic example is Germany. Germany very slowly and intermittently pieced back together Germany. They took back the Rhineland and the Saarland, basically doing that. They also got the Sudetenland, they got Austria, and eventually all of Western Czechoslovakia. And of course, it didn't work so well with Danzig and Poland, but you get the idea. If you do small bits slowly over time, your counterparty rather, your opponent doesn't really feel the sense of crisis that they might if you just went all out and declared war. You know, the question was always, is there going to be war with Germany? Well, let's try to avoid it. Let's try to compromise, etc., etc. And so long as those compromises involved Germany getting territory, they knew they could kind of keep it up. They got what they wanted, basically, over time. So that's salami tactics in a nutshell. I'm sure there's a more technical name for it. But that's what I remembered off the top of my head. And so the fear is that China might do something similar in the South China Sea, if not the Pacific Ocean generally, but I don't really see how it would play out. If it's rocks in the ocean, then alright, but there's only so many rocks in the South China Sea. I don't think they're going to be able to do that with Palawan, or Mindanao, or, you know, the Malay Peninsula. It doesn't really seem workable to me. They haven't expressed any desire to move into actual territories. Thus far, it really has just been controlling that region of ocean. Now, again, there's a debate to be had about whether or not the U.S. should do more to try to contain that, and whether or not that is legitimate or legal or what have you. I'm not saying it is or it isn't. I'm just saying I don't think that it can. I think that it can only go so far before it kind of hits a wall. They could go beyond that wall, but then they're really escalating, and at that point, there really would be a response, not the sort of half-hearted, well, I don't know what to do response. The whole point of salami tactics is small bits. But if you run out of small bits to take, what are you left? You pretty much have to escalate or stop at that point. I welcome input on this because, again, I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert on Chinese foreign policy in the South China Sea. And I'm sure there are some people listening from the countries involved who might have an interesting perspective on that. I would encourage them to share their perspective in chat if they haven't already.
Please help me understand salami.
The reason they call it salami, if you're not familiar with that word, because I know we've got some non-native English speakers, salami is a type of sausage. And basically, you slice the sausage into individual slices when you eat it. That's kind of where that name comes from. Let me see. I'm tempted. The question is kind of broad, so I'm kind of meandering all over the place trying to answer it. The economic tension is the principal tension there between the U.S. and China. And there's a whole... I guess I'll save it. That's a whole conversation in and of itself. The nature of the economic competition between the U.S. and China, what the U.S. can do about it, why China does what it does, how likely it is that China can be deterred, etc. We talked a little bit about that last week. If somebody wants to get into that, ask Fuzzy Cord a question and we can get into it. But for now, I'll leave it. I'll try to focus on this specific question. Are U.S. and Chinese interests incompatible? No. Short answer, no. They could get along if they really wanted to. They would just have to put aside some of their overarching strategic concerns to do it. And it's hard to do that when there's so much tension in that economic relationship, which is why it might escalate. But if they could get past that, there's not really any reason for China and the U.S. not to get along. You could say the same thing about Russia. I mean, fundamentally, there's not really much reason for the United States and Russia to be in any kind of competition. I mean, Russia has its sort of economic sphere of influence, if nothing else. It wants a de facto political sphere of influence, but I don't know why. I don't really know what they gain from that. I think that is reflective of the... I think that just reflects the mindset of the government in Russia right now, which is very much about controlling things. I think I remember hearing from a dissenter from Russia years ago when Putin was really starting to kind of solidify his grip on power and starting to narrow the ambit of civil society in Russia. He said that they're never going to stop. They won't stop until they control everything. That's how they think. And he's, of course, referring to the Siloviki, these sort of ex-national security type people who sort of predominate in Putin's government. If you don't control it, it's a threat. That's kind of the perspective, and that's sort of an old Soviet political cultural norm. That's a sort of an old school perspective, but that is kind of what they have done. And so I kind of wonder if that doesn't color Russia's foreign policy too. There does seem to be a desire to not just have a free and open economic, if not politically cooperative relationship. They really seem to want to have more direct influence, if not de facto control, politically over major decisions. Not all of them. I'm not saying Russia wants to invade and conquer the Ukraine. I'm sure there are some Russian nationalists who would like to, but I don't think it's really high on the Russian government's to-do list. I think they would be quite content to have a de facto veto over major decisions in Kiev and Minsk and other such places. But other than that, other than that sense of overreach and the sense that if something isn't done, then that Russian ambition might exceed their mere sphere of influence, there's not really anything else to fight about. I mean, Russia needs to sell its natural resources because that's the principal source of their government's revenue. It's the big part of their economy. So on the one hand, yeah, they can use that as a political tool, but they need to sell it more than the West needs to buy it. So that kind of limits its effectiveness. There's a reason that the most effective places that Russia has been able to leverage its energy power has been in relatively impoverished parts of southeastern Europe. It's not really the Germanys and the Scandinavias that the Germans are really influencing with that. It's more the parts of Europe that are very poor and are more dependent on cheap, discounted gas sold from Russia and Gazprom. That's really where that form of influence is most effective. And that's going to be limited over time if those economies develop. Maybe they don't. There's obviously problems with corruption in certain parts of the Balkans. Some would argue all of it, but I don't think that's fair. But certainly there is a lot of corruption in the Balkans. But if they do develop economically, then eventually that advantage that Russia has there will erode. But if Russia and the US could reach a kind of understanding about their respective powers and responsibilities and norms in Europe, mostly Europe. Russia's in the Middle East, but I still don't think particularly highly of that. That doesn't seem like a lot of... Without getting too much into that, I don't know that Russia has a lot of power to project in the Middle East, such that it can really be a major power. It can stop the Syrian government from collapsing, but I don't know that they can really do a whole lot else. The region's politics are very complex. As Russia is finding out now, the Russian government is kind of facing a bit of a strategic conundrum right now in Syria because it's having to kind of balance Saudi interests and Saudi concerns, to say nothing of Israeli concerns and interests, with the Iranian concerns of interest. The Iranians being their nominal allies, but also being relatively weak. So the Middle East is not the kind of place you really want to get mired in. And, even the United States, which has a lot of power, struggles to kind of get its way in the region. I don't know that Russia is going to be able to do a lot better, but in Europe, Russia has a lot more pull. So I think some kind of agreement there between the US government and Russian government would be a lot more feasible. And, if there were a kind of understanding about the extent of influence and powers in the region, there really just would not be any fundamental reason for tension and conflict. Obviously, the Russian government would be upset about things like the National Endowment for Democracy, which is this institution that the US government has created in order to support democratization and democratic reformers around the world. To authoritarians, that feels a bit like the Internationale, like the Comintern, as it was called in the early 20th century. The Comintern was a communist organization created by the Soviet Union to propagate communist revolution in other countries. So authoritarian countries kind of look at the National Endowment for Democracy in the same way. They kind of see it as this force for revolution and instability, kind of an arm of the US government that is meant as a weapon to destabilize their societies and target their rule. I think they read too much into it. It's not that effective an organization. I'm sure they wish they were, but really it's more just giving out grants. You want to set up a Twitter thing, or you want to do an activist campaign or whatever. Oh, okay, here's some money. Have fun. Good luck. Try not to get arrested. It's not like this all-seeing CIA organization that just really manipulates people into trying to overthrow their own governments. I think that's a bit of a stretch. We can talk about that too if somebody wants to, because there's more meat to that conversation. Anyway, I think I've belabored this question enough. I'll just let it go at that. When you say party politics in China are opaque, is that to the rest of the world or Chinese citizens as well? Oh, it's not only would I say it's to Chinese citizens as well, it's to people in Chinese government as well. Because, in an opaque political system, it's not just about not showing your cards to people outside your country. It's also in a system like the Communist Party system, which, like I said, is Hobbesian. There's no rules. Well, there are some rules, I'm sure, but there's no real rules. Power within the Communist Party of China does not come down to promotion on merit. It comes down to who you know. It's called guangxi in China. That's networking, basically. If you can be a part of a powerful network in China, then you will get ahead. If you can't, your options are much more limited. Your options and prospects are much more limited. And in the Communist Party, because that's the way it's set up, because it is all about who has the biggest and most powerful network, it's very cutthroat, because networks compete with each other all the time. And because they compete with each other, and because the nature of these networks is amorphous, because you don't really know who's in what network. And in fact, it's not just a matter of individual networks competing with each other, they overlap with each other. You can be a part of multiple networks. So navigating that maze of competing networks and interests and people trying to always get ahead and attack their rivals, that's very cutthroat, very difficult to navigate. And the end result is that nobody really talks about it. I mean, they'll talk about it in private, but there's no big open map of all the networks out. So you have to be risk averse, because you never know if the guy you're talking with is going to stab you in the back and try to put somebody loyal to him in your position. You've got to be really tough and savvy to survive in that kind of political system. And so because of that, because of the nature of that system, it's opaque even to the people operating within it, because they're not really governing China. You know, technically that's part of the job, but most of their time is spent trying to navigate this kind of Byzantine cutthroat political system, which grievously punishes people that are defeated. Like, if you fuck up, then you are well and truly screwed. There are people who have been, disappeared. There are people who go to prison. Like, Xi Jinping being a case in point, the Tigers and Flies anti-corruption campaign. Thousands of party officials went to jail as part of that campaign. And a lot of them went away probably for authentic, real corruption. But a lot of the people were also targeted because they were rivals. They were not loyal to Xi Jinping. If you're going to become powerful in a system like that, you need to make sure that the people under you are loyal and they're not going to stab you in the back. So you make sure they're dependent on you, and you make sure all the people who are not dependent on you are not in government anymore. You can do that in a multitude of ways. Use your imagination. Probably not violent, to be fair. It's not like it's not like that anymore. It was like that in the 70s under the Cultural Revolution, and a lot of people in the party were very upset about that. And that was kind of the whole reason they started instituting some norms of behavior within the party in the 1980s, like the one I talked about before. Again, those have started to break down under Xi Jinping and his drive for power, but that whole fact that those norms established in the 80s were so fragile and so easily broken just illustrates the point I'm trying to make. Like, you can never be certain of your position in that kind of system. In American politics, it can be cutthroat too. You never know if somebody will pull their support or what have you. But you roughly know where everybody stands. Everybody's out in the open with what political party they're at, what political affiliation they have. Generally the cutthroat politics are more specifically in Congress amongst individual and between individual politicians trying to negotiate alliances, trying to negotiate deals, legislation, what have you. In China, it's whole of government. It's like that Japanese movie Battle Royale, where they have all the kids on the island fighting each other to death. It's like that only politically. Everybody is in power, and it's so bad that you really can't even stay clean. Because what'll happen is the guy above you will say, hey, you're doing a good job, I want to promote you, but I'm not going to do it unless you pay me a bribe of, X amount of money. Oh, okay. So all my hard work is either for nothing, or I pay the bribe but then get my hands dirty. Well, which do you pick? Well, you can say no, but then you're that guy. You're the guy that people don't know if they can trust. If you bribe the guy above you, you get your hands dirty, but he also feels like you're in his network, like he can trust you because he's got that dirt on you. So you build a relationship with him based on trust, at least what trust you can build. But then in turn, that plays out throughout the political system. There's an old saying, the fish rots from the head. So if the guy at the very top of the political system does that, then everybody below them does. And that's actually one of the reasons bribes are so big in the Chinese political system. Your boss demands that you pay a bribe. The only way you can pay it is if you demand that the person below you pays you a bribe. Now, the guy above you knows that you can do that, so he keeps making the bribe higher, because you have more people under you who can pay that bribe. So there's a kind of bribe inflation in that way. That's what happens. And, people pay immense amounts of money to try to get ahead, or have. I don't know what effect the Tiger and Flies campaign has had on that culture. Maybe it's inhibited it somewhat. It's just really hard to tell because again, the system is opaque. Like, there's nowhere you can go to kind of see where people lie, where the system is, what the political culture is, how people feel about it, because nobody can talk openly about it. Certainly not to outsiders. In fact, if there's one norm in the Communist Party of China that has persevered throughout the entire history of the PRC, the People's Republic of China, it's been that you don't talk about politics outside of the party. There's this idea of democratic centralism where you can debate political issues with other party people, with other people in the party, but once a decision is made, you commit to that decision. Even if you were a dissenter, even if you argued the other point, once the party makes the decision, everybody has to get behind it, and everybody has to push it to the rest of society. So there's a very strong norm that you do not engage people and civil society outside of the party about political issues. That's a norm that survived, and probably will continue, not least because it doesn't really threaten anybody's career to observe it. All of the other norms, there's advantages to breaking them. Breaking them isn't inherently threatening, although it can be a bit risky. So those norms have kind of largely fallen by the wayside. Now that said, to be fair to Xi Jinping, continue this long-winded answer, one of the things Xi Jinping has tried to do since he's come to power is institutionalize politics in China. He's tried to create stronger, better organized institutions in China that are more effective at doing what they're supposed to do. So that could be a prelude to a kind of institutionalization of political maneuvering within the Communist Party itself. You know, up till now, the institution building has been outside of the party. It's targeted mostly the apparatus of state, the actual bureaucracy of the Chinese government, but not the party itself. Now, on the one hand, that would be really good for China's political culture on the long run, but it's also super risky. Because in order for any set of norms, formal or informal, to work, they have to be accepted by everybody. You know, you can't just pass a law that says, okay, this is how it works. You know, really, if somebody wants to break a law regarding political infighting and, you know, succession and things like that, they're going to break it. There won't be much you can do about it. Once they have enough support within the party, they're going to make it happen. So you have to have buy-in from the whole party to make any implementation of new norms work. And I don't think there's enough trust among the party actors, among party members to make that work. So I think Xi Jinping is more likely to focus on reforming the apparatus of state, maybe the economy, maybe society itself, but not so much the party. And, you know, he doesn't have a lot of incentive to, because right now he's winning that game. In the game of who's on top of the political part, of who's on top of the Communist Party of China, he's winning. In fact, he pretty much won. So if you're winning the game, why change the rules? You know, he's got the high ground. He's got all of the key positions. He's got his people where he wants them. He's been very effective. He's probably one of the most effective politicians of the past 10 years, not just in China, but just the world. Because it's not easy to be a politician in China and to make that happen. Like, you've got to be very cunning. You've got to be very, you know, you've got to have a lot of guile. You've got to understand how the political system works. You've got to be willing to stab people in the back. You know, there's just, it's a very alien environment if you grew up in a democratic political system where there's just so many more rules and restrictions about what you can do and what you can't do within a political party and within a political system. So that's my long-winded and hopefully not too confusing answer as to why I think that the political system in China is opaque even to people, even to the politicians who operate within it. There's no openness. Everybody has to lie and misrepresent their position in order to try to survive politically within that kind of Hobbesian state. And so then obviously the Chinese people themselves are cut out, and I kind of explained that when I talked about democratic centralism. Like, they're not really meant to be involved in the major decisions. That said, I will, as an aside here, as a further tangent, I hope I'm making sense. As a further tangent, the way Mao Zedong designed, and other people, but mostly Mao Zedong, designed the Chinese political system back in the 1930s and 40s, there actually was meant to be a role for public in policymaking. It was not meant to be the legislature. The National People's Congress is obviously rubber stamp institution. That doesn't really mean anything. But there was meant to be a de facto institution where people were allowed to criticize the party. You know, Mao Zedong did not want the party to become bureaucratized. He wanted the party to maintain its links to the people at the grassroots level. And so he invited and welcomed criticism at the grassroots level against the party and some of the party's policies. That was the original vision. Now, obviously, that kind of waxed and waned with time, but even today, the party will nominally tolerate protests that are against specific policies and specific government officials. So long as you're not protesting to bring down the whole party apparatus, the whole system of government, there is relatively more tolerance for protest and dissent. But that said, once the party makes a decision, a law of democratic centralism, the party expects you, the citizen, as well as the party, to toe the line. Like if you want to criticize something that's done badly, or somebody who's implementing the common party line badly, or some specific example of corruption, or what have you, that's okay. You can petition the national government. You know, one of the common themes of Chinese politics is people criticizing local politicians or a local government, but then they'll say, oh, you know, these guys are just doing communism wrong. These guys are just bad leaders. I need to appeal to the higher party where all the good people are, and then they'll come and save me and deal with all these bad actors. That's a very common refrain in China amongst Chinese citizens. That's just their perspective. You know, there is still a lot of legitimacy for the Communist Party of China within China. And, you know, obviously some of that has to do with political repression, but there is honest faith that the party is good for China, has been good for China. Obviously, there were problems. People will admit that, you know, but they point out that China has done really well under the party since the 1980s. And so for that reason, a lot of people are kind of willing to give the party the benefit of the doubt and kind of give them the wheel, so to speak, for the country, to give them their support. We'll see how much that support lasts, the turbulence that's coming. You know, obviously, we've talked before about the Chinese economy and how it's going to have some problems in future and just, in general, probable political problems in future. You know, for whatever reason, Xi Jinping has this vision for Chinese society where Marxism and socialism are still the core moral tenets of Chinese society. I really don't think it's going to work. I'm very skeptical that that's going to happen, you know, because it really feels a lot like Christians in Western countries complaining about the general decline of religious faith in the West. You know, all these people kind of turned away from religion over time as the West modernized and developed into these modern developed economies. And, you know, I've talked a little bit before, way before, about how, you know, there's something about an economy developing that has an impact on society that is corrosive to traditions. You know, an economy that develops generally sees its people become more independent, more individualistic, and less willing to kind of tolerate old traditions that kind of imposed certain behaviors and norms on them. So you've kind of seen that happen to Christianity in the West, less so in the United States, but you can even see it here, or just people kind of become less Christian. In general, societies become less Christian, rather, as the economies develop. And you're probably going to see something similar in China. In fact, you probably already are, where people are just in general skeptical about these grand ideologies, which are kind of the modern stand-in for religion, in a sense. We've talked a little bit about that before. We've talked about, well, basically the idea is as China develops, people will become more skeptical about these sort of sweeping things like religion and like socialism that had kind of been, or at least nominally are supposed to be, the core moral tenets of the nation. So I don't think the Chinese government is going to be any more successful in imposing values on a population than anybody else has been, even with all of their power and policy tools. I think they're going to struggle mightily to do that. So we'll see if that isn't itself a source of instability in the future for the Chinese government. How the hell did I get onto that?
Couple tangents. Took a right, left.
Oh, I was talking about, yeah, the original vision for Mao Zedong's original vision was to have the people be more part of the process, and even today they can still kind of do that within certain limits. And, you know, the line is very gray. You know, where the limits are is kind of ambiguous, but technically there is some free space there, just so long as it's within certain understood norms. Actually, I was talking with Fuzzy Cord, I guess not talking, but chat talking with Fuzzy Cord before we started about the Great Leap Forward. And one of the reasons for the Great Leap Forward was because of the failure of the campaign that happened before that, called the 100 Flowers campaign. Now, Mao Zedong was not an economist. Like he was a very good politician. He was a very good organizer. He was a very good guerrilla fighter, tactician, strategist, what have you. He was a really smart guy. Like, whatever you think of his ethics or morality or, all the umpteen million people that died under his regime, like, legit smart guy. But he was not good at managing an economy. That was his weak spot. In fact, he himself had admitted as much early in his career. So why then would Mao Zedong push something like the Great Leap Forward, which is an explicitly economic policy? Something that he had not really previously done. He had generally eschewed economic policy to focus more on the political and social side of the new government's rule, of the new People's Republic of China. So one of the things that happened in the early 50s, besides the purge, they went after a lot of people who were class enemies, I believe is what they called them, landowners and whatnot, principally, among other various bourgeois groups. In addition to that, there was a campaign called the 100 Flowers campaign, in which the government invited people to criticize the party. This went beyond the original vision that Mao had of allowing people to just kind of to vaguely, in general, participate in policy decisions by kind of critiquing the party now and again. This was a full-fronted invitation to Chinese intellectuals to critique every aspect of party rule in China. This is in the early 50s. It was a disaster. It went very poorly. The criticism went well beyond what they had originally envisioned. They thought criticism would be about economic policy and very specific policy issues. But a lot of the criticism went beyond that and criticized the very nature of the system that the Communist Party had set up. And, a lot of that criticism was legitimate. I mean, it's the same sort of stuff you could say now. The party is too opaque, the decision-making is not democratic, it's too corrupt, there's no way you can manage a country with this kind of bureaucratic, closed-off structure without it becoming corrupt. And that really unnerved the party. They were not willing to accept that degree of criticism. They wanted cooperation, not a challenge. And so Mao Zedong had to respond to the 100 Flowers campaign's de facto failure with a massive crackdown that saw a lot of arrests, and in general, it was not a good look for the party. Keep in mind that the Communist Party of China, one of the reasons that it had been so successful in the 1940s was because it was an umbrella organization. It was not just radical leftist communists who joined the Communist Party. There was a lot of legitimate nationalists, people who were not kind of on the fence about communism, but who were real Chinese nationalists, who joined the party because they saw it as being the most organized, best-run alternative to the Kuomintang. And, we did a thing months ago about, how bad Kuomintang governance was in nationalist-governed China. So the Communist Party kind of created a lot of good PR by just not being complete assholes, in mid-20th century China. That's not to say they didn't do certain questionable things. I'm sure there's a lot to criticize there, but compared to the Kuomintang, they kind of came across a bit angelic almost. So that created a big tent organizationally, and there was a lot of people who didn't necessarily agree with everything the party did and thought on things like social issues and economic issues, but who were otherwise loyal because they saw the party as delivering China from the century of humiliation, saving them from the Kuomintang, etc. Finally delivering a unified nationalist China, finally, after so many decades of struggle and civil war and invasion, etc. Well, all of that goodwill was blown after the 100 Flowers campaign and that big crackdown that followed. After that, a lot of people who were not considered sufficiently ideologically pure, i.e. a lot of those people who had been part of the party but were not necessarily left-wing communists themselves, those people were targeted. Among, obviously they targeted the intellectuals that had complained about the party and critiqued the party, but it went beyond that to encompass a broader cleansing of the party faithful. It wasn't enough to have just been a Chinese patriot who really invested in the party as being the vehicle for a unified China, you had to be a left-wing communist. Or at least not be sufficiently suspected of being anti-communist. So that created problems for Mao Zedong, because that was seen as a personal failure on his part. It had kind of been his initiative. And after that failure, he started to lose a bit of his support within the party. There was still the cult of Mao, for sure. But it wasn't as strong then as it was later in the Cultural Revolution, but it was there. And because he felt his power in the party kind of eroding, because he kind of felt like the party was turning on him, he felt a bit pressured to try to deliver on something big. He wanted to try something new, to try to kind of redeem himself after the 100 Flowers campaign. And that's partly why Mao ended up pushing the Great Leap Forward. And you know, Fuzzy Cord, I know you're listening. If I'm getting some of this wrong, please do jump in and correct me, because I know you're more up to date on this than I am. But that's what I recalled. You know, there was also the fact that Mao had got a little ambitious. You know, it had been expected after World War II ended, well, after the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949, that it would take a long time for China to ever achieve the communist utopia that it wanted, that it would take decades of economic development and recovery. But China's economy recovered so quickly in the early 1950s that there was I think maybe Mao was a bit tempted to try his luck. Maybe if we really push ourselves, then we can really achieve communism much sooner. Maybe within my lifetime. That kind of thinking. You know, the conceit of the middle class is to think that change only matters if it happens within their lifetime. If you ask them to try to plan long-term, to try to dedicate themselves to something they'll never see, they kind of roll their eyes and get bored and leave. And Mao himself kind of, well, it's true. It's true. It's very hard to get people to commit to a cause long-term. Now, to be fair, sometimes the long-term cause isn't really believable, like, oh, you know, you're never going to be able to achieve that. You know, it's hard to get people to really invest in it, but that's what you have to do. You have to have a core organization that is manned by people who have faith in that long-term mission and are willing to make the necessary sacrifices. For a long time, Mao himself had done that. But, you know, in the early 1950s, I think he faced temptation. I shouldn't say I think, because that feels a bit like editorializing. Here's what I know. I do remember reading that one of the contributing factors to Mao Zedong starting the Great Leap Forward was a sense that Chinese economic development was ahead of schedule and that they could kind of push ahead and reach new heights. That's what I remember reading. Specific. Where was I? Okay, I lost that whole train of thought, so that's probably for the best. That's probably half our runtime on 2 questions, so let's try to salvage this. Next question. What is your opinion on the Israeli apartheid comparison? Oh boy. Thanks for that. That's one of those poison pill questions that you can't please anybody with. You know, there's no answer I can give that will not get me yelled at by somebody. So let me think about that. There is some truth to it, because there certainly are political actors in Israel who just want the land. They want Palestinian land, and they don't care how they get it, and they want to do what they can over the long term to try to dispossess them and have that land be a part of Israel. They want Judea and Samaria, which is what they call that territory. I think most Israelis are not like that. I think their issue is that they just don't... I think there's a general exasperation, not only among Palestinians, but amongst Israelis themselves, about how to deal with this intractable issue, you know, this conflict, which will not die. People have lived and died within the time span of this Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and it just feels so intractable. And I think for those people, the issue is not how do we steal the land, how do we oppress Palestinians? How do we make them pay for what they've done? You know, yada, yada, yada. I think their issue is more, we just don't have any tools that we feel are effective in negotiating with the Palestinians that don't involve violence. Because there is a perspective that the Palestinians themselves are overly reliant on violence. And because the Palestinians are, you know, you could say for good reason, are so radical, if not radicalized, and so militant that there's just nothing short of a hard stick that's going to kind of deter violence. And I think Israeli arguments that, you know, about incitement and that kind of thing, there is fairness in that. You know, certainly it would be better if there were more of a non-violent alternative to Palestinian resistance to the occupation, such as it is, because I know some people don't like that word, but such as it is. But if there were a non-violent alternative, that would be a lot better for them, and it would make the game theory, so to speak, for the Israelis a lot easier. Not that they would necessarily take that. You know, that leads into a conversation about Israeli politics and some of the different people and interests involved there. But I think most people in Israel would welcome an end to the conflict and don't mind compromise. They just don't think it's feasible. You know, there's a real perception, especially after Gaza. You know, Gaza was the big thing. You know, Ariel Sharon wanted to hand back Gaza. He also wanted to hand back the West Bank. Unfortunately, he fell into a coma before he could do that. That's one of the great historical tragedies, perhaps. You know, maybe he wouldn't have handed over the West Bank if he hadn't been in a coma, but maybe he would have, and a lot of this could have been avoided after the fact. But anyway, Ariel Sharon wanted to give back Gaza. He wanted to end the occupation of Gaza. And he did. He pulled out. And Hamas took power almost immediately. Hamas was the principal political force in Gaza. And the reason for that is because the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had been the nominal representative political force for the Palestinians in negotiations with Israel and in the conflict generally for some decades, was perceived as corrupt and ineffective. And that's why people in Gaza turned to Hamas. Hamas was radical Islamist, but at least they were trying to do something. You know, Palestinians, like Israelis, are sort of out of ideas. Like, how do we deal with this? You know, they're on our land, so we need to revolt. We need to rebel. You know, this is a liberation revolution of the vein that you saw across colonial Africa, colonial Southeast Asia. We have to fight for our land like they did against the Europeans. And with that kind of perspective, no surprise that they've been very violent, because for them it's just a raw nationalist campaign. And we talked before about how powerful nationalism is as a motivating factor. But the Israelis, in turn, their perspective is rooted more in the 1920s. The 1920s and 30s, when there were a lot of Zionists coming in and settling, what would you call it then? I guess it was technically Palestine then. Settling in Palestine and creating a crisis in which, trying to remember what they were called, there's Ashkenazi Jews and there's Sephardic Jews. And I think Sephardic Jews are the ones that are actually native to Palestine and the Middle East. So because there were so many Ashkenazi Jews coming in, it started to tilt the demographics of Palestine. And the Arabs felt threatened. And that was especially problematic at that time, because at the same time, the Zionist movement was really kind of finding its legs in the 1920s and 30s. Pan-Arab nationalism, another ideology, was also taking off.
We've talked about that in some of the earlier episodes.
Yeah. So Arab nationalists basically started fighting with Zionist nationalists. You know, what was basically the people who would become Israeli nationalists. And it tied into immigration, because a lot of these people were coming in from other places, and it just turned into a big shitstorm. Now, from the perspective of the Zionists, they were just moving in and wanted to be neighbors. They didn't want to cause any trouble. That, again, their perspective. I'm not going to get into that. But then all of these really aggressive Arab nationalists came and started shit with them. And there was a whole series of tit-for-tat killings and riots and protests, and it was a very messy place in the 30s and 40s. So from their perspective, the Arabs just don't want them there. From their perspective, the Arabs have been trying to get them out of Palestine from the start, from the 20s and 30s on, and that everything the Arabs have done since then has just been about attacking them. And the Israeli perspective is that we can't really compromise because then they'll just come after us. And the whole Gaza thing played into that, because what did Hamas do after they had control of the province? They started firing rockets into Israel. Now, again, you could argue that that was a legitimate thing to do given the overarching occupation and national liberation perspective on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. From that perspective, it's more justified, but from the Israeli perspective, it's genocidal, because again, from their perspective, the Arabs are just trying to get rid of them. For them, all of that violence, even the modern low-level violence against them, is just a continuation of that previous struggle, that struggle over land and the right to be there. The Israelis talk a lot about the right to exist. They need to recognize our right to exist. And that's not an unfair request. The Arabs also, though, have a point in saying that Israel is an artificial construct of the United Nations, which they saw as being an illegitimate European organization that basically just carved up Arab territory against their will. There's an argument there, too. But, at some point, the arguments and counter-arguments have to go somewhere. I mean, you could go all day about this. I haven't even studied the Palestinian-Israeli issue in great depth. And just talking about it makes me confused, because there's so many different perspectives and angles, and it's been so politicized. And the political actors involved on both the Palestinian and Israeli side are so politically savvy that they've done a very good job about muddying the water. They tend to ambiguate the nasty things their side does and exaggerate the things the other side does. It gets very hard to make a clean judgment. I mean, fundamentally, it just comes down to a conflict over land. I think the Israelis are partly right in characterizing it as a continuation of the 20s and 30s conflict over land, because that's kind of what it really comes down to. But then, unlike the Israelis, I would argue, what do you do with that? Like, where do you go with that? I mean, obviously, there was a lot of tension there, but there has to come some point when there's some kind of agreement. And the Israelis, I think, really don't do themselves any favors by taking a very hard line. Again, like I said earlier, there's an argument to be made that there's just no other language but violence that you can really use, that all of the negotiations have gone nowhere, etc. But if you want to understand the Palestinian perspective, you really have to understand it as a national liberation struggle. That's their perspective. And from that perspective, it's no surprise that there's violence. It's no surprise that Hamas was violent after Gaza, after the occupation of Gaza ended, because the occupation of West Bank was still ongoing. So long as there's any occupation of Palestinian territory, that resistance, quote unquote, as the Palestinians characterize it, is going to continue. So just pulling out of Gaza was never going to be enough. You also needed to pull out of West Bank. Now, the Israeli counter-argument to that, like I said, we could go all day with this. The Israeli counter-argument would be, well, that just shows how unreasonable they are. That just shows that they're never going to compromise. If it is a national liberation struggle for them, why would they ever stop? Why would any concession ever be enough? Why would they ever stop until they had all of the territory that had at one point been Arab? Because there are big chunks of Israel that used to be principally populated by Arab people. So if Israel did end the occupation of West Bank, what's to stop the Palestinians from continuing, firing more rockets at Israel, continuing the boycott Israel campaign, continuing to do all of that until they got right of return, which is, one of their big asks. Almost certainly never going to get the right of return. Just about. Almost certainly never going to get that. But who's to say? It's the Middle East. Anything is possible. But the point is that the Israelis would say that national liberation struggle characterization just shows that no compromise is possible. I don't think that's true. And I think there are a lot of political actors in Israel who go out of their way to make that argument, implicitly or explicitly, in order to justify a hard line, because they're actually pursuing an alternative agenda, so to speak, that being sort of the settler agenda. We haven't even talked here, I don't think ever, about politics in Israel. Whenever anybody and their mother talks about Israel, they always talk about Israel and Palestine. But it's been pretty rare to talk about Israeli politics by themselves, just politics in Israel, or for that matter, politics in Palestine. You know, they are separate things. You can talk about Israel or Palestine without talking about the other. And if you did, you would see that there's a lot of political actors in Israel who have a vested interest, either ideologically or otherwise, in propagating a confrontational approach to the Palestinians. And the settler groups and arch-conservative groups within Israel are the principal example of that. The Palestinians are not innocent in that regard either. There are definitely groups who don't want to stop at anything but the expulsion of Jews from the historical territory of Palestine. But ultimately, it kind of falls on the moderates on both sides to try to find some middle ground and try to push out those more extreme violent voices. And there have been efforts off and on to do that, but it's just so difficult because there's so much mistrust between the two groups. You know, no sooner is an agreement made than some asshole goes and, you know, stabs a bunch of people, or goes and, you know, demolishes some houses of some families of some people who might have been peripherally involved, you know, with some terrorist act somewhere. I mean, it just goes on and on. It's really hard to beat that. It's really hard to beat that kind of cultural momentum in that relationship. You know, I mean, ultimately, I think the Israelis will have to make some kind of show of good faith by relaxing the occupation. You don't have to end it per se, but relaxing it significantly. And the Palestinians, in turn, really need to deliver nonviolence. They don't have to stop hating Israel. I don't think anybody expects them not to hate Israel. Not even Israel. Even Israel just says, look, just recognize our right to exist. You can hate us as much as you want. Just leave us the fuck alone. That's kind of that perspective. The Palestinians need, if the Israelis can show that act of good faith, to show that they can control their more extreme voices and to exact something resembling a governed space. You know, there are governed spaces in Palestine, but it's all kind of cut up into different areas, and there's overlapping authority with occupation authorities. I mean, there's a whole institutional clusterfudge there that kind of needs to be worked out. And it's hard to see the Palestinian Liberation Organization doing that because it is itself so corrupt and dysfunctional and sort of incoherent. It doesn't really know what it wants to do half the time. And it does seem to kind of fly on autopilot a lot, you know, in fairness to critics of the PLO. So I think there really needs to be an effort to reform the PLO, and that has to come from within Palestine. And that same effort has to encompass trying to create a united front among all Palestinians that can negotiate as a common front. If the Palestinians can promise a period of nonviolence, like a month where there's no violence, or a year, or whatever, if they can promise that and then deliver, that would go a long way to building faith and trust and building a bridge to a potential agreement down the line. So I think that if there is going to be a peace agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians, that's probably what it would look like. And that's no small feat because, again, there's a lot of vested interests who really don't want that, and you would have to overcome them. And that's very challenging to do when the political relationship and environment is as toxic as it is already. So that's a rough read on the overarching. And that's very rough. I'm not an expert. I'm sure somebody in chat knows a lot more about it and is coming at me. I'm sure there's a lot of people who don't know a lot about it also coming at me. That's fine. You know, again, I welcome the input one way or the other. People's opinions are welcome. I like hearing it all, you know, because everybody has a perspective, and all of those perspectives are important to understand in order to understand the wider world. But just in general, that's my impression of the Israel-Palestine issue. And so, having said that, I hope helps you understand why I'm a little cagey on the apartheid comparison. Is it apartheid, the regime that the Israelis have imposed on the Palestinians? Kind of. It depends on your point of view. It really depends on your perspective. Certainly, there are a lot of restrictions, especially in certain areas. There's like A, B, and C type areas of occupied Palestinian territory, and I think some of them have a lot more military presence and policing than others. But that said, it's not the same as apartheid because it's not one country. It's not the Israelis necessarily saying, okay, you're inferior, so you're second-class citizens. You can only do certain things within our one country. It's rather somebody from a different country coming in and occupying a different country and trying to control it and impose their vision of rule and order, law and order, rather. And of course, the counter-argument there is that that's not what they're doing at all. It's all just oppression. They're trying to annex the territory, even if it's not technically all Israel now. That's what the Israelis want to make it in the future. And so in that vein, this is kind of a proto-apartheid. This is what it's going to look like in the future once Israel fully annexes all of these Palestinian territories. That argument depends entirely on Israel actually doing that at some point, and whether or not that happens is something that's going to happen over the long term. You know, whatever forces in Israel want to annex Palestine, they're smart enough to know that they can't do it in one big gulp. It's going to be, well, to have a callback, it's going to be salami tactics, which is basically what we've seen. You know, little settlements here and there slowly encroaching on Palestinian territory over a very long period of time. That'll be the smart way to do it, because that's the way that's least likely to generate a massive backlash that forces you to give up big concessions. So, kind of a non-answer. But that's what you get for asking for my opinion. Because opinions are messy and ambiguous, and, you know, opinions really depend on your access to information, and without all of the information relevant, I can't really give, like, a solid conclusion, which is what I would prefer to do. So, broad general question gets a broad general answer.
Yeah, there was another sort of question I got earlier that is kind of, it's not in the same sphere of big, complex country-to-country and people-to-people relations, but when they ask me, what is your opinion on weed? There's not really a great way to approach that question, given that it's a scheduled substance in a lot of areas, so you have to have a very sort of business-appropriate response to it. When a lot of people, I think they ask it not intending to put you in a bad position, but there isn't really a great way to do that.
Oh yeah, I'm not ragging on the person who asked the question. I don't mean to give that vibe. I'm explaining why the answer that I gave was so, well, meandering.
Well, I said before we got started with this that during this segment we're not really focused on passing judgment on certain things, and that if the listeners feel like the situation requires, well, we need to pass judgment on this group, they're doing bad stuff, then they're free to do that. But I feel like we can trust that they're smart, they can figure it out. We don't need to tell them how to interpret stuff. They can interpret it based on the facts that are available to us to share.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. I would encourage those interested in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, certainly those with a much stronger background than me, let me know how that answer was, because I don't know enough about it to be super confident about that depiction of events. So I would be very curious to hear it, to get some input on that. If nothing else, just people's impressions. Let's see. Next question. Aren't regulations that discourage foreign actors from partially owning American businesses against free market principles? Yes. Short answer, yes. That is against free market principles. It's not necessarily unprecedented, because here's the thing. You can justify almost anything on national security grounds. If you can cite national security, then the government can take what is effectively emergency action. It has powers that it would not otherwise have. So while I don't think it's in the tradition of free market non-intervention, which the United States has, it's well within the tradition of the government overreaching to deal with national security threats. That's definitely not unusual. I guess that's kind of a short answer. I'm very tired, so if I missed the crux of the question, feel free to ask again, and I'll get back to it. I think I covered it.
Yeah, I think that's a nice, refreshing change of pace from some of the longer ones. It's okay to have short questions and short answers.
Yeah, after giving like 3 30-minute answers in a row, I'm a little paranoid. Maybe I'm missing something in that, but yeah, I'll go with that for now. Let's see. What are your thoughts on the Canadian government buying the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipeline? I was not aware that the Canadian government had done so. And in fact, I'm not sure I remember what the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline was. So I did not know about this. Thank you. Something I can look up. I do know that there's been, there was a pipeline in British Columbia, I think, that the government had to, what was it? Did they have to buy it outright? Maybe that's the one you're talking about. Basically, the deal fell through because I think the province of British Columbia kind of gummed up the regulatory works because they didn't want it. And the Canadian government did want it, so they're kind of jumping in, I think, to try to make the pipeline happen. That's partly to, you know, help out the energy sector in Canada and diversify exports away from just the United States. You know, so many energy exports from Canada go through the United States, so there is a desire to tap new markets there. I'm not sure if this pipeline I'm thinking of is the same one as this one, but if it is, not a bad move. I mean, it makes sense. It's just good strategy. You know, you want to diversify your markets. You don't want to be too dependent on any one group, and it'll be good for the energy firms, you know, any people who work in them. I think most of the criticism of the pipeline has been environmental more than anything. And, you know, that's all good and well, but when it comes to grand strategy, environmental issues tend to be of secondary concern. You know, there are overarching economic and strategic interests that generally take precedent. So, in so much as the pipeline has been challenged by the province of the British Columbia, it's been delayed, but I don't think they can prevent it from happening. Obviously, there's an argument to be made that it shouldn't happen anyway because the firm, the private sector firm that had originally been building it, cited as one of the reasons for stopping basically the pipeline, which is what prompted the government to get involved in the first place. They cited the fact that it was no longer economically viable as a reason to stop production, which was not really good enough for the Canadian government, having supported the project and wanting to kind of reap some of the benefits. So they kind of stepped in. It's not as unusual for the Canadian government to do something like that. It would be very strange for the U.S. government to step in. But for the Canadian government to kind of get in there for what it sees as a project, an infrastructure project even, that is very important for the success and health of the Canadian economy and its growth and its, you know, basically all of the stuff I already said. For those reasons, it warranted government intervention. And I think overall there's a sufficient sense on the part of the national leaders of Canada that the pipeline is needed, that it's going to override the parochial provincial concerns of British Columbia. It probably will be built. If you're looking for an environmental critique of the pipeline, I'm not the guy. I'm not, you can probably tell, I'm not well versed in a lot of environmental issues, so that side of it I'm not familiar with.
I'm not an expert either, but I don't think pipelines improve the ecosystem.
Yeah, that's what I've read. That's from what little I've read about it. That's pretty much the that was the argument presented, that it releases a lot of gases into the air, and it there's the possibility of a leak, and that can do a lot of environmental damage, sometimes permanent. And there's all of the, you know, tearing up. Just the fact that you're building the pipeline creates disruption in the ecosystem. So. Roughly some random things I remembered from an article.
When's the last time you saw a moose rejoice about a new pipeline?
Never.
Well,
wait.
You go.
Maybe there was an episode of Rocky and Bullwinkle.
Oh.
Maybe then. But I don't think any real moose. So, roughly, I mean, I could talk a little bit about the environmentalists as a political force in British Columbia. You know, that's a little more in my wheelhouse. You know, British Columbia has a history of being, it's kind of like the California in some ways of Canada. You know, it's a little more liberal, it's a little more open, it's a little, environmentalism is more of a political concern there. So in that sense, it makes sense that British Columbia would be the province to kind of try to stop it, to kind of interfere in the project. But I don't think they have enough political support nationally to really force through that vision, you know, to really stop the pipeline from being built. I think ultimately it is going to be forced through. For every British Columbia, there's an Alberta, so to speak. Let's see. What do you think about CNN trying to sue for the jury member names in the Manipur tribal. I hadn't heard about that. I didn't know they were doing that, or thinking about doing it. It's probably a dumb idea. As I recall, the reason the judge withheld the names of the jurors was because of ostensible threats made against both the judge himself and the jurors. So for that reason, the names were withheld. Maybe they'll continue being withheld later on. I don't know exactly how that works. Oh, I skipped a couple questions. I'm sorry. Oh yeah, you're right. I did, didn't I? Sorry, like I said, very tired. I played Stellaris for too long. I'm a 4X addict. I can't help myself. I just wanted to play the tutorial, and it turned into an 11. Oh yeah, it was very fun. It had a very light learning curve, which I was not expecting. I was expecting it to be a little more steep, you know. But it was sufficiently, the learning curve was sufficiently mellow to kind of ease me into it. So I went from, I'll play the tutorial for an hour to playing it for 11 hours of straight. And going to bed at 11 in the morning like a fool. You'd think I'd know better by now.
Promise I'm an adult.
I promise. I promise. I definitely didn't eat cake for dinner tonight. I haven't eaten dinner at all tonight, but I did have a slice.
A slice of Stellaris.
But it were so.
It's low
but
calorie.
it were so. But I swear, Neuro, don't worry. I'm definitely gonna get those bastards that fucked me out of that choke point. I swear to God. That was supposed to be my choke point, and they took it from me.
God damn it.
Nothing turns people into Nazis like losing an expansion phase in an early game 4X builder.
God damn it.
That was my land. Sorry, this is one wild-ass tangent. I don't know how that happened. Yes, I skipped some questions. I'll go back to those. Thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for letting me know. What do you think about CNN trying to sue for the jury member names? Yeah, they were threatened, so I think they have good reason to kind of. I think that is a legitimate reason to withhold the names. I don't think CNN is going to get them. I understand that the public has a quote-unquote right to know, but if the judge really feels that there is a threat to life, I understand that there is a legal mechanism by which they are entitled to that protection. And I think there is a good argument to be made that in a case as sensitive as this one, given the hostile and toxic political environment in the US, not a bad idea. I'm sure CNN has a much better argument for why they should have the names, but I don't know it, I'm not familiar with it, and I think I would struggle to conjure one, given my present state. So I'll spare our listeners that entertainment and move ahead. I'm sorry that's not a particularly satisfactory answer, but that's kind of what I've got. That's what I'm limited to, given my unfamiliarity with that particular story, to say nothing of the legal system in general. Okay, what did we skip? What do you think of the massive Chinese investment in African countries recently? They're helping build infrastructure for the region to develop and have a very strong influence over there. What does that imply for the future? So there is a lot of Chinese investment in Africa. Quick side note, I promise not an everlasting tangent. A lot of media says that China invests in Africa. China does this, China does that. And the impression is almost like the Chinese government is doing it. It's not, it's Chinese companies. Some of them are state-owned companies that have strong ties to the government, but it is a commercial agreement. It's not really strategic per se. You know, most of it is buying land for agriculture, for sale back in China, if not in Africa, and a lot of investment. Most of it is big investments, you know, big infrastructure type things that are designed more to help Chinese firms, especially state-owned enterprises. But there's also a lot of small-time investors who kind of come to live in Africa and kind of make a life for themselves. There's kind of more and more of Chinese like that in Africa. It's sort of been one of the big untold stories of African demographic change. They're not so big that they're going to change the demographics of Africa, but they're a much larger minority than they ever were before now. But basically, like I was saying, a lot of that infrastructure spending and loans that China and Chinese companies make in. Let me double back real quick and make a difference. There's a difference between Chinese companies investing in commercial projects and institutions like the Asian Development Bank and the other equivalent that China started, making loans to a government for an infrastructure project. Those are two separate things, and the media tends to conflate them. So there's a lot of commercial projects in Africa that involve Chinese economic actors, but that don't really involve the Chinese government per se, or big Chinese loans. That's one type of investment. I would expect that investment to happen as China becomes a bigger economy and as Chinese companies get bigger and start looking at places outside of China for investment opportunities. That's just a normal part of an organic international economy. So I would totally expect that. I don't read into it a lot of... there are some critics who say that some of that commercial activity is dual use. But I don't think it really applies in the commercial realm. I think that is more the infrastructure realm. So understand that when people critique Chinese investment in Africa, what they're really critiquing is institutional loans to African governments from Chinese economic institutions like the Asian Development Bank and the other one whose names I can't... That's going to bug the hell out. I have to look that up now. What the hell is that? Bank, China. Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. That's not what that is. That's a trade agreement. Okay. Maybe I'm talking out of my ass then. There is another bank, though. I do remember that. That is a vector for Chinese investment in Africa. But just keep in mind that when the media talks about Chinese investment in Africa, they're talking about big institutional lending like that in that vein. And a lot of that is not done by the Chinese government or those institutions altruistically. It's not meant to just develop Africa for the sake of developing Africa. There's a lot of strings attached to those loan agreements that involve hiring Chinese companies and corporations, and especially state-owned enterprises. And it's the state-owned enterprises bit that's important, because I don't think if not for that, I don't think if that were not a part of the puzzle, that the Chinese government would really be interested. Because like we talked about last week, the Chinese government really wants to prop up state-owned enterprises in China. They're very inefficient. They tend to lose a lot of money, but they also employ lots of people. And the Chinese government and the Communist Party of China specifically does not want to take the kind of political heat that would come with the mass layoffs that would happen if they liberalized state-owned enterprises in China. So that said, it's very expensive to just continuously subsidize them, so it's very helpful if they can generate orders outside of China, generate business outside of China, to try to alleviate some of the financial pressure on the Chinese government to try to prop up these giant state-owned enterprises. So part of the reason China has gone out and done the One Belt, One Road initiative, gone out and done the Silk Road initiative, gone out and done loan agreements to build infrastructure in Africa, is to generate demand for major state-owned enterprises in China, and to kind of make those subsidies a little less burdensome for the Chinese government's budget. That's one of the big factors. There's also building influence in Africa in order to generate diplomatic support, in order to generate new economic opportunities and ties that can be used as leverage in future, just in case. You never know when you might need to use them, in case somebody opens their mouth a little too much. So that's a vector of influence, kind of influence building over time. And then there's the dual use argument I mentioned. Military commentators, in so much as that's a thing, but roughly speaking, this is where I read this critique from, point out the fact that a lot of the infrastructure being developed, for example, ports in, say, Sri Lanka, being the big recent example, are meant to be nominally commercial ports, but could easily support military ships, operations, logistics, what have you. So in that sense, they're dual-use projects that could be used for either commercial or military projects. And the suspicion is that the Chinese government wants to develop a lot of ports and other infrastructure in South Asia, East Africa, Southeast Asia, that could in future be readily converted to military use and serve as a quick springboard for the projection of force when in the future the Chinese Navy is more capable of projecting force. It's a little too small right now, but they're getting there. And they could easily have all of the infrastructure in place they need to project force in the Indian Ocean in place before they get there, using dual-use infrastructure project developments. That's the criticism. I don't know how valid that is. Because on the one hand, yes, those are dual-use projects, but there's no requirement on the part of the countries involved in developing those projects, in which those projects are developed, to allow the Chinese military to use them. Now, the counter-argument, I think, to that would be that the Chinese government is lending all of this money to these countries specifically to make them in debt to the China in order to get them to do what they want, to act as a form of leverage to try to lean on those states and get them to let China use those facilities in the future. I don't really agree with that, because it assumes that being in debt to a big country means that they can tell you what to do. If you need evidence of that, look no further than Argentina, which owed a lot of money to various major financial institutions, and for something like 10, 15 years, basically just ignored them. And in the end, they only got a relatively small amount of the money. You know, they still got some back. It was still a lot of money in the end that the banks got, what they called vulture funds. But they took a big discount. They didn't pay back everything that they borrowed. You know, small countries are very clever about not paying back loans. Like, if you don't want to pay it back, there's not a whole lot they can do to stop you. And really, the only reason Argentina paid back its loans in the end was because that it could not borrow money outside the U.S. It was only in the U.S. where there's strong rule of law and strong institutions, strong economic institutions like stock markets and whatnot, bond markets and whatnot, where lenders were comfortable enough to lend to Argentina. And when Argentina failed to pay those people back, then the legal system in the U.S. was put into motion, and they locked them out of the financial market in the U.S. And once Argentina was locked out of the U.S. financial market, nobody else was willing to lend them money, and they just could not borrow. And it was very damaging for a long time for the health of the Argentine economy. They pulled it off for a while because of high commodity prices, but then after 2008, those crashed, and then they were pretty much back to square one. So the reason the United States was able to make that work is by having an extremely liquid financial market that was able to lend to other actors with confidence. It gives lenders confidence that they can get paid back. There's not really an equivalent with China. Like, China's financial market is very nascent. It's very new, and it has a lot of structural problems, to put it mildly. So, you know, if you don't pay U.S. lenders back, you have a big problem, because they can lock you out of the overarching lending market, because that's just how important the U.S. financial sector is. If you don't pay back China, so what? What are they going to do? If they lock you out of their financial sector, or if they say, well, we're not going to lend you any more money, then all right, fine. Then you're just back to where you were before. You can just go borrow money from the IMF or from American banks or from, you know, Western institutions or what have you. It's not really too much of a problem. Obviously, you burning some bridges, you would rather maintain economic relationships than destroy them. But, you know, if the Chinese government notices you're in debt and then really starts leaning on you, you can just say no. There's not a whole lot they can do to really punish you. If your economy has a lot of strong ties to the Chinese economy, they could lean on you that way, and maybe that would coerce you. But they wouldn't need the loan to do that. They can do that without the Asian Development Bank and without the infrastructure projects. They can just boycott you or put sanctions on you, and then the damage to that economic relationship would be enough to deter you. China doesn't have as much such economic leverage over Africa, so in those cases, the infrastructure spending is more necessary. It's kind of, if China is trying to build influence around the world, they kind of have to do more infrastructure spending and lending in places that are further afield, that are not as tied to the Chinese economy. But it's a risky strategy because, again, they can always just leave. It's not as though there's just one source of lending. You know, but the principal dominant lender is still out there, that being Western institutions. So they can always turn heel and just go to somebody else. Pakistan is about to do that. Pakistan is having major economic difficulties owing to inflation, a faltering currency, a lot of inefficiency in its market stemming from the preponderance of not quite state-owned enterprises, but basically military-owned enterprises that have been dominated by the military and are not particularly well run. All of that's come together to create a big economic issue for Pakistan. And they've already taken, over the course of this economic crisis, they've taken a number of loans from China to try to deal with it, and it didn't work. They didn't use the money wisely. They didn't implement any reforms to try to alleviate the crisis. So having burned through China, guess who they're going to? They're going to the IMF, because there's nobody else. China's not going to lend them any more money. Beijing knows better now. Like, all right, we already gave you so much money, and you didn't do anything with it, so why would we give you more? So that leaves the IMF. So that speaks to the weakness of this strategy. You know, even if you are greatly in debt to China, if you really need to bail out, you have to go to the West, and at that point, the West has leverage over you. They can kind of push you. If you really screw with the West, then they can just say, well, no, we're not going to bail you out, then you can just crash. You can just go beg China for more money, and then China has to make the choice between maintaining that relationship by dumping untold billions of dollars into a country that has a lot of trouble managing its economy, or they can cut them off and try to pressure them into reform. But at that point, the strategic relationship is damaged, and the government doesn't get as much out of that. So what to do? It's a dilemma. So it's not... This approach that China is taking, again, if this is the approach they're taking, I'm skeptical that they're actually just trying to build influence around the world. That's a side effect. It's not the primary objective. I still think the primary objective is the state-owned enterprises and the Chinese economy specifically. But if that is what they're trying to do, if they are trying to build influence, there are some benefits. They are building bridges. They are building strong relationships with certain countries that they could use as leverage later. But that fundamental weakness to the strategy is that some of those partners are unreliable and don't have to depend on China. They could turn on a hat. They could turn on a dime, so to speak. So that's my general impression of Chinese investment in Africa and the developing world. It's perceived as a threat among certain quarters in the West, but I don't think it's entirely justified. You know, certainly a lot of the countries involved would not really tolerate an imperial China any more than they would tolerate an imperial West. Some countries will be more subject to influence than others in the future, but I think overall China will find it very challenging to project force broadly. So I think we pretty well covered that. Do you think a land value tax of the kind proposed by Henry George would be a better way to fund government than our current ways of taxing income, capital gains, sales tax, etc.? Not really. Let me preface this by saying that I'm not familiar with Henry George's argument on this. So let me pull that up in a tab so I can look at it later. Henry George land tax. But in general, property taxes are not great. You know, I live in Texas, and here in Texas, almost everything is paid for with property taxes. A lot of it is paid for with sales taxes too, but at the local level especially, property taxes is the big source of tax revenue for localities. And it tends to have a very powerful segregating effect. Because generally, if you live in a really expensive house, you need to have a really expensive income then to pay the relatively high property taxes for that house. So the rich people tend to live in the nice neighborhoods, and then everybody else tends to segregate by income into individual neighborhoods. Lower income people don't really have to pay property tax. I think that's the way it works, either low property value or low income. But generally they get clustered together anyway because everybody else leaves for the more expensive markets or expensive locales. So that's kind of a social reason it's not great. It does have that effect, and not everybody likes that. Fiscally speaking, it's kind of a regressive tax. obviously, a lot of this depends on how you structure it. You know, if you only apply the land tax to people who own a lot of land, like the super rich, that could be affordable, depending on how high it was. But I don't think you would be able to generate enough revenue doing it like that than you would with the income tax, plus the capital gains tax, plus the sales tax, etc. More to the point, it distorts the overall economy in ways, in a number of ways. You know, the housing markets themselves get distorted. Again, it just depends on how you want to do it, because you could say, okay, it distorts the market, so we're going to have a sliding scale. It's going, you know, the marginal rates are going to be low, and it'll be a shallow curve that doesn't disrupt the housing industry too much. But, you know, even then, it's still going to be a problem. I mean, just in general, my impression, because that's what I have to rely on here. Again, I haven't read his arguments, and I would want to before I really committed on a true deep critique. But my impression is that there would be problems with generating enough tax revenue to replace the alternative sources of tax revenue that you'd replaced. And there would be problems with market distortions. And there would be problems with how you designed it. Mind you, getting something like this done politically would be next to impossible. It would be very difficult. There would be constant infighting about whether or not it was a good idea in the first place, and then even if you could get people to sign on to it, there would be constant fighting about the exact way to do it. You know, what relative share of the burden of such a tax should be placed on which group. That debate would just drag out interminably. And invariably, one interest group or another would get their tentacles into it, and it would probably come out very skewed in their favor in some way. Interest groups do not just refer to lobbying groups. It's also, that can also refer just to people of certain political persuasions or perspectives or whatever. You know, it's a broad term. I use the term very broadly here. Just any number of people with a particular perspective could leverage their relationships, their political power, their whatever, to try to get a disproportionate voice in the shaping of that legislation, which would probably result in suboptimal tax policy. So that's what I think about it, but that's just broad big picture. Again, I would really want to look at his specific argument to kind of get a better impression, to get a better read on it. Let's see, aren't regulations... Did I skip another one? No, okay. Oh, okay, now we're back to where we were. Okay. What do you think of CNN? All right, I recently learned that the Communist Party of China is still very intolerant of the construction of memorials to the victims of the Great Famine of 1959 to 61. What other examples of curtailing of freedom of speech on a country's politically sensitive topics are you aware of? On a country, so not specifically China, just any country. Whew. There's never any shortage of examples. I read about them I have a Twitter, if anybody's interested. You know, those of you who are new might be interested and who enjoy the content. I post articles every day and give a little blurb to each article, kind of explaining how it's relevant and what it says, etc. So a lot of the stuff I post on there has to do with authoritarianism and oppression of one sort or another. Not always. It's, you know, it's all over the place. There's lots of different things there, but over the course of a week, there's going to be a lot of authoritarian stuff in there. So let me try to conjure up some examples here. Oh, okay, I need to remember, you specifically say politically sensitive topics. That's tough. So in Egypt, they passed a law just this past week that greatly expands the government's ability to regulate and restrict use of blogs and social media in general. You know, so that was part of an effort, an ongoing effort, to try to suppress the political expression of sentiments sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood, which the government sees as its archenemy. It also hates plenty of other people. The Egyptian government is very dismissive and very much dislikes liberal reformers, people who just want secular, open, democratic, pluralistic government. Those people are targeted too, but they're not nearly as large a group. Muslim Brotherhood is a much bigger group, and so there tends to be a lot more focus on suppressing them. in one form or another. So the sensitive issue in question stems from the period of the Arab Spring, in which there was briefly an open window of political discourse in Egypt, and the Muslim Brotherhood ended up being one of the biggest parties. And eventually they became very unpopular because it turns out they were not very good at governance. But rather than waiting for an election in which the public could kick them out of power, the military acted first and basically undid the Arab Spring in Egypt. They took it as they took the government's unpopularity as an attempt to reinstall military rule, rather than actually just try to perfect the democratic institutions that people were trying to form. So one of the things that happened in the aftermath of the de facto coup against Mohamed Morsi's government in Egypt, that was the Muslim Brotherhood government, there was a big protest around a mosque. I don't remember what it was called, but a whole bunch of people got killed. The government cracked down and lots and lots of people were killed. So the government goes out of its way to censor discussion about that and reference to that online. Now, that's an example of a government trying to restrict speech on the internet. That's the most common type of repression right now amongst authoritarian countries, because dissenters have come to rely so much on the internet as an open, free space, increasingly less so, unfortunately. That's a whole other conversation. There are other more tangible expressions. I imagine those more tangible expressions are more what you're thinking of. I don't know if I could think of anything like a memorial, like an equivalent to a Great Leap Forward memorial that I could point to that would be seen as not kosher. One of the things that's happened in Russia over the past few years is, over the past 20 years rather, is that more and more people came out with stories about the gulags. There was a bunch of memorials created to people who died in gulags and basically the brutality of Stalinist Russia in general. And over the past 5 to 10 years, there's been an increasingly intolerant reception of those memorials, museums, what have you. You know, they get targeted more and more. And at first, they wouldn't get rid of them. They would just censor them, or they would make them change the tone of the museum or memorial. You know, it was little things, and now they've kind of graduated to outright shutting them down in some cases. So that's a politically sensitive issue for the modern government. I don't know why they do it. It seems stupid to me. I don't know what the Putin government thinks it gains by doing that. I think that's not so much fear of dissent. I think that's just more the government trying to impose a national ideology. One of the big missions of the Russian government under Putin, since he came to power, is creating a strong national identity, because it had kind of fractured after the fall of the Soviet Union. And there was a strong sense that, you know, there wasn't enough patriotism, the country is falling apart, you know, we need people to be proud of Russia again, to band together and make Russia strong. And so there was a big drive to create something of a Russian ideology that people could kind of rally around. And it kind of worked, but not fully. There's a lot of people who are kind of on the fence about it. There's obviously Russian nationalists who are all in. They're always all for that. But they only make up a certain proportion of the population. Everybody else is just kind of meh. They're not that engaged by that sort of perspective that's being pushed as the national perspective. That varies from person to person. Everybody's different, but in general, that's my impression of Russians, how Russians perceive that crackdown against dissenting opinions. And I think the Russian government's infatuation with Gulag museums is that it doesn't really quite fit in with their revisionist history of Russia. You know, they want to build a history of Russia that people can be proud of. And so they tend to kind of whitewash a little bit the Gulag period and the Stalinist period. You know, they prefer people to focus on the positives rather than the negatives. I think that's more their perspective. And, you know, every country does that. That's not something unique to Russia. I'm not ragging on them. But that is an example of a government kind of, well, in my opinion, mishandling, but kind of trying to censor a significant a sensitive historical political event. Let's see. India doesn't really do it so much. I'm sure somebody could think of an example, but there's no big systematic examples I could think of. Let me see. Yeah, I'm blanking out. I'd have to look it up. There's lots and lots of examples of online censorship. That's much easier, but specific examples of like museums and shrines and things like that, I have trouble remembering that more specifically. I guess, no, the Confederate statues thing doesn't really fall into that. That's kind of a different, separate issue. But yeah, there's, if you looked, I'm sure you could find lots of examples. You know, any authoritarian country wants to monopolize political memory, political perspective, and political thought. That's sort of their whole bag. That's their whole mission. And part of that is maybe not erasing history, but whitewashing history. Let's use that. That's a good word. You know, making history out to be something different than what it was at the time.
History, the best parts.
Exactly. You know, selectively picking at it, reinterpreting it, you know, adding little bits and pieces, new interpretations, or maybe ignoring others, that kind of thing. Selective history, let's put it like that. You know, every government, every people, every society does that to a degree, but authoritarian governments turn it into a model. You know, that's their business, very much their function. And they take it to extremes, which generally results in stories like Great Leap Forward, museums being shut down, and, you know, things like that. But I'm sorry, I can't quite think up of a lot of examples off the top of my head here. If you asked me a question about Stellaris, I could probably answer the shit out of that.
Nice.
I guess I'm still learning, though, so maybe that's not true. There's still a lot of things I don't know. But I'm getting there. It's a little more fresh on the brain. Let's see, where were we? Thoughts on that, recently learned. What do you think about the military value of the South China Sea Chinese man-made island? None. Not really. They have some.
Symbolism.
I mean, yeah, that's exactly it. It's purely a symbolic, it's almost purely a symbolic exercise on the part of the government, and probably more the military. I suspect the military is pushing it more than the party is. Yeah, it's mostly about national pride and expressing Chinese assertiveness to try to kind of look strong after the century of humiliation and politics, basically. I mean, if you build a couple bases on those islands, guess what gets targeted in the first day of a war with the United States? All of those islands. The United States has lots of long-ranged, over-the-horizon weapons that could hit them. They might have some anti-missile technology by the time that happens, but I suspect that there would be a way to defeat it. I mean, if nothing else, if somebody can shoot down a missile, then you just throw lots of missiles at them. There's always such a thing as too many missiles. So long as you use that amount of missiles, you're going to be able to overwhelm them. This isn't just China. This is the same criticism made of the U.S. position in the Pacific. You know, one of the criticisms was that the United States military was too centralized in too few bases in the Pacific, and places like Okinawa, Wake, maybe not Wake, but Okinawa, Guam, etc. Places like that, those were very important nodes, but because they were just so concentrated, in the event of a conflict, they would be big targets. Like, if you could take out those bases, that would be a big strategic blow to the United States. That's one of the reasons that the U.S. military introduced I think it was called the Air-Land Battle Space thing. I don't remember exactly what it was, but basically the gist of it, or part of it, was strategically distributing U.S. forces more thinly across the Pacific rather than having them concentrated in a few places. And so that led to little movements, what they called rotations. They have agreements with a number of nations now to rotate troops through places like Darwin, Australia, Malaysia, you know, Indonesia, etc. And it's not a whole lot of troops, it's just some. And it's just meant to make them, to create less of a tempting centralized target in the region, to make U.S. forces in the region more versatile and more survivable. So that same weakness is faced by the Chinese in setting up their islands in the South China Seas. It's a great place to project force if you just want to deter and control trade through the South China Seas and to intimidate regional nations. But in terms of their ability to actually really command that space in the event of a conflict, I'm skeptical. They would have to dump a whole lot more military resources into the South China Sea in order to really have a credible deterrent against a U.S. offensive, shall we say. And I want to add here, because these conversations about a war between the U.S. and China kind of crop up when talking about the United States and, you know, its tensions with various nations, specifically China. But I think often people talk about a war between the United States and China as though it would not inevitably go nuclear, which it would. If there's a war between the US and China, somebody's going to start to lose at some point, and then they have to ask the question, how much do I want to not lose? And if the answer is enough to nuke the planet, then there's going to be a nuclear war. And given how invested you have to be to start a war over something as minor as rocks in the ocean, I gotta think that you gotta be desperate enough to go nuclear. You know, it's a matter of pride, symbolism, nationalism. If the Chinese start to lose, they're not gonna back off. And it won't start with like Skynet Terminator levels of Holocaust. It'll start small. If the Chinese start to lose, they'll start using tactical nukes. Well, if they're going to use tactical nukes, the US is going to use tactical nukes to even the playing field. Well, then everybody gets nuked, so then most of the conventional forces will probably get wiped out. Again, there will probably be better point defense technology in the future, but again, there's such a thing as too many nukes. You throw enough nukes to overwhelm them, it's done. If you know they have point defense technology, you're going to do that. That's how you prepare for that. Oh, you have a new point defense technology, I'm going to invent and lots of nukes, or missiles, or whatever. So at that point, one side or the other is going to get pushed out of the region, and at that point, the war could easily escalate into a strategic nuclear exchange. It would start with targeting strategic targets, strategic military targets in the region with nuclear weapons, and then the other side would retaliate, and then it just escalates from there. It goes nuclear, is the point I'm making. Like, there's no way it doesn't at some point in some way. And that's the big reason that everybody, the leadership positions of the United States, the Soviet Union, and now Russia and China, don't want a war. A lot of what we see is posturing in order to pressure the other side, to try to intimidate them, to remind them that they are willing to go nuclear if they are, but that it would be best if they didn't, because then everybody dies. On the other hand, if you roll over and send no signals that you're willing to fight over something, even if it goes nuclear, well, then the other side is going to use salami tactics, and that's it. They win. So you do have to be at least somewhat confrontational to counter that. There has to be some deterrent value to your strategic position. Even in a nuclear standoff, you have to be at least willing to go to a nuclear conflict. Otherwise, the other side can bluff their way to a win. But anyway, that's getting into a whole conversation about nuclear war. Also not an expert about nuclear war. Perhaps you can tell. But basically, no, I don't think there's a lot of strategic value to those islands. I think it is mostly political. It's more of a political weapon than a military weapon. Let's see. Do you think Trump is putting Erdogan into Russia's sphere of influence and out of NATO? I don't, and we talked about this last time, I think, and I'll kind of give a succinct version of that now. Leaving NATO and embracing Russia would create a lot more strategic problems for Turkey than it would solve. Turkey has a strong economic relationship with Europe. It has a strong security relationship that benefits its military in a lot of ways, with the West and the United States in particular. And there's also, not as much as there used to be, but nominal coordination on regional affairs in the Middle East. Now, granted, there are tensions in the relationship, but I don't think they're so great that Turkey, well, the Turkish government, would want to rank ranks with the West and become an explicit rival. Because once Turkey becomes an explicit rival, there's nothing to deter Europe and the United States from just loading up on sanctions and cutting them off from the military, supporting political groups within Turkey that want to change the government. I mean, an explicit rivalry would not go well with Turkey. Turkey just does not have the economic or fiscal or military resources to compete with Europe and the United States. It would like to be a bigger player in the Middle East, and I think that's more what they're trying to do. I don't think Turkey is leaving the West. I think it's just becoming more independent in its foreign policy. It wants to have a sphere of influence in the Middle East. Erdogan probably sees it as the Turkish inheritance from the Ottoman Empire. He has this weird affinity for, you know, the Ottoman Empire as a conservative in Turkey. So there's kind of that angle. But beyond that, I don't think they really want to break with the West. I don't think that is going to result in an alliance with Russia. It might result in more cooperation with Russia, but I suspect a lot of that cooperation would actually have more to do with putting pressure on the United States than it would be an actual attempt to change their strategic alignment. You know, it's a little bit about like shacking up with somebody to make your ex jealous. You know, it's like, oh, I'm going to be with this person just to spite you. That doesn't really mean that relationship has legs. That doesn't mean you really like that person. It just means you want to piss off somebody. And I suspect a lot of Turkish policy vis-a-vis Russia is like that. I suspect it's more about trying to generate leverage that can be used in its negotiations with the United States vis-a-vis Syria and vis-a-vis the Gulen issue, more so than it does any real desire to go and just expunge Western influence from the region and become a Russian ally in doing so. So that's my perspective and reasoning on that. I don't really see Turkey leaving that. I think it's just more politics. I might add here that I could be wrong. You know, I mean, in any of these answers I've given, I could be easily wrong. And that just speaks to the necessity of having strong institutions, either institutional norms informal norms or formal norms. Just have some norms between nations. Institutions give rules in order to otherwise chaotic relationships. And in those cases where you have institutions that give more certainty, you don't have to worry about whether or not something is being done purely for politics. You just know what's going to happen. You know that there are rules, restrictions that people will not cross. And in that way, that was sort of the benefit of the traditional international order, such as it was after World War II. That's obviously falling apart now, and the result is not a more equal world or more opportunities for new rising powers. The real outcome is just a lot of confusion and ambiguity. You know, if you want to have a different regime, create a different regime with different rules. But having no institutions, either formal or informal, governing relationships between nations creates a lot of confusion, a lot of risks, and a lot of potential for inadvertent escalation that results in undesired consequences. And it's this kind of ambiguity that kind of reflects that. You know, does Turkey want to leave the West or not? I don't think so, but they could. In a more rules-based institutional order, it wouldn't matter, because the Turkish government would respect norms and adhere to the rules and norms they had signed on to previously, and the United States would respect norms that restricted their pressure on Turkey and its various interests in the Middle East. Nobody does that anymore, or at least not as much. And the results are clear to see. There's just ambiguity, uncertainty, and confusion. It makes it very difficult to plan ahead, even into the medium term, let alone the long term. And it creates a lot of risks economically that people have to price into their business. You know, either into prices themselves or into the ambit and scope of potential investment. So that's kind of the indirect cost of having this kind of open, personality-based international order rather than a rules-based institutionalized order. That's a little tangent. How do tariffs on solar panels affect? How have the tariffs on solar panels affected the renewable energy sector in America? Short answer: they're more expensive. Long answer: I'm not as sure because I didn't follow that story deeply after the fact. What I remember reading was that it was really hurting a lot of solar panel companies. Because, well, not solar panel producers. If you're a solar panel producer, you get higher prices. That's not bad for you. But the big fear amongst the solar panel industry was that the product would be more expensive, and so fewer people would want solar power. And I haven't followed the industry since then. So I don't know what happened with that. I don't know if the industry did see a downturn because of that, because of higher prices, or if that didn't really quite come to pass for some reason or another. But that was the big concern, that the overall industry would be hurt by those higher prices introduced by tariffs. That's a good question. I should follow up on that. Because that is, I have been trying to follow the overarching trade policy evolution of the Trump administration. But the solar panel thing has kind of been overlooked in favor of the more recent steel and aluminum tariffs, the proposed automotive tariffs, and the sundry tariffs that have been placed on China. So the solar panel industry kind of got overlooked in all that. So that's a good tip. I'll try to look into that and have something for next time. Let's see.
Tariffs.
Why don't more countries try to copy the Nordic model and adapt it to their specific needs and problems? It seems fairly simple to me. It's definitely not simple. Because here's the thing. Political institutions of any kind that emerge in a country are always a function of those countries' histories, cultures, demographics. I mean, all of the unique things about that country that led up to the present all contributed to the formations of the institutions that govern that society. So it's really hard to just take institutions from one society and then stamp them onto another society. You know, trying to do that is like putting a square peg through a round hole. It just doesn't quite fit. You know, in order, yeah, you know, if institutions are to work, they have to evolve organically in conjunction with the society that they're interacting with. Because there are so many intangible factors that go into determining how effective an institution is. An institution like a government institution, which is what you're asking about, or even an economic institution or a social institution or whatever. All of that needs buy-in from the population to work effectively. The population has to understand it, accept it, recognize the informal rules and restrictions and norms, and accept them and adhere to them. That's really hard to do with the society that is completely alien to a given institution. Like people who are not familiar with how a Nordic political system works, like say a lot of developing countries, would really struggle to implement that. Because it depends a lot on civic action, strong civil society. It's understood that everybody kind of pulls their weight, and you know, there are some things you just don't do. I had an article on my Twitter a week or two ago about, I forget what it's called, Green's Law or Grawen's Law or some weird Swedish thing. Basically, the idea, it referred to informal norms in Swedish society dictating interpersonal behavior, and one of those norms is that you do not act or communicate anything that would imply that you are better than somebody else. And that's part of an overarching culture of humility in Norway, and it's part of an overarching culture of cooperation and tolerance. Those factors are important to the operation of a Nordic governing model. Because in order to have a model where the state does a lot, takes a lot of action, people need to trust that the other people in their society are not abusing that. Because if there are abuses, then people lose their shit. There are people who say, okay, it's inevitable that there's abuses, but I still think the benefits we get from the program are worth suffering those abuses. There are definitely going to be those people. Every policy is a trade-off. There's always going to be people who weigh the costs and benefits differently and come to different conclusions. But there's always a group, there's always a subset, and generally it's large, that sees abuses and loses their shit. It is not acceptable to them. So in order, almost invariably, for a setup like that to work, people have to trust each other and believe that there are not a lot of abuses happening. Otherwise, there's fracturing in the electorate, fracturing in the body politic, and it just kind of falls apart. It just doesn't work. It's not viable politically without that level of coordination and cooperation and mutual understanding. that kind of cultural institution in itself underpins a lot of large, successful states, like Sweden or Norway or Denmark, what have you. There's also the fact that you need a relatively wealthy economy. You need a good economy that can produce the kind of high-wage, high-productivity jobs that governments need to generate tax revenue to pay for all of that. Alabama cannot have socialism. It's not because people don't want it, and a lot of people don't want it, it's more just because they don't have the money. If Alabama wants socialism, they're going to have to get it from California. And I don't think California is going to be game for that. It's just, socialism is expensive, let's put it like that, and it requires a lot of not only social infrastructure to underpin it, it just requires a lot of effective governance, it needs anti-corruption measures, oversight, and it needs political elites who recognize that corruption is bad, that there should be limits to what they do, and that just because they can do something doesn't mean they should. There's a lot of informal norms in politics that you just cannot legislate, that are critical to the successful functioning of an efficient government. And you can't force it. You know, most of the societies that have that evolved it organically. You can give government in a box to a society that is just perfectly designed in every way, but if you don't have that underlying social infrastructure, if you don't have that underlying economic support base, if you don't have those critical factors, it's just not going to work. It just can't. It's just going to become dysfunctional, it's going to become corrupt, there's going to be all manner of political problems. In the long term, maybe. In the long term, maybe the society evolves and the institutions evolve with it in a way in which everybody is on the same page, and then the institutions can work efficiently. It may not work in the way the Westerners would like, but it will work efficiently over the long term, hypothetically, given that opportunity. I might also add that high-wage, high-productivity industries tend to cluster together in relatively small areas. You know, spatially speaking, wealth tends to be concentrated. The wealthiest part of Europe is in the Low Countries. You can actually draw a circle, basically, around the English Channel, you know, roughly around Calais. And that circle will encompass Belgium, the Netherlands, northeastern France, southeastern England. That is one of, if not the wealthiest region on the planet. There is so much industry, wealth, money, finance that it puts everything else in Europe to shame. There are other parts of Europe that are very developed, but nothing so concentrated as that area. And you'll see areas of concentration of industry and wealth like that. The northeastern US is like that. Western California is kind of getting like that. It'll probably take more time to get as big as the Northeast, but the Northeast is definitely the 800-pound gorilla in the US economy, spatially speaking, regionally speaking. And the reason that's a problem, if you want to adopt a Nordic style of government, you know, a sort of soft democratic socialist style of government, is that it's very hard to do it on a large scale. Like Sweden, Denmark, and Norway between them have a population of maybe 30 to 40 million people. It's very small. And because they have a lot of high wage, you know, it's developed, it's economically developed, but it's also very concentrated there. What if, you know, let me put it like this, because this is more the direction I was trying to go in. You can't really compare Denmark and Sweden to the United States, for one, because that's a whole other order of magnitude. You could have socialism in the northeastern US, maybe California to a degree, but everywhere, you know, to have a national level socialist program, I don't know if it could work because there's just so much, so many parts of the US that are weighing down the average, that would be sucking resources from those more productive areas. So if you want to compare Sweden to the US, it would be more accurate to compare Sweden to the northeastern US, or the Midwest, or a specific wealthy region of the US. In contrast, a more fair comparison, if you want to look at the U.S. as a whole, would be to compare the U.S. to Europe as a whole. And if you look at Europe as a whole, you have very wealthy regions, but just like the U.S., you also have very poor regions. And it's not really clear that having like a European States of America, for example, that was strong and centralized, would be able to deal with that any better than the United States government has. There are just some areas that are poor, because you can't have an automotive industry in every country. There are some industries that are just very large, very industrialized, and need to clump together to be efficient. And because they clump together spatially in very particular areas, that ends up being a loss for everybody else. Like Bulgaria, Romania, the Balkans, the Ukraine, they can't all have an automotive industry. You need scale to have a successful automotive industry. And without that scale, you just can't do it. The only way to make it happen is to open up your borders and try to mutually, all together, create conditions that are conducive to the development of an automotive industry that can take advantage of a larger market, a regional market, than what you could offer just as a simple small nation. So Sweden has the benefit of being a small nation in one of the wealthiest parts in Europe, in its continent, in its super, in the overarching region that it's in. Sweden is in the wealthy part, and it's in a very homogeneous part, and it's a very quiet part, and it has all of the history and social infrastructure and economic infrastructure that it needs to make that system work. Nobody else really does. I mean, there are sorry, go ahead.
One thing that's worth pointing out too is the population of Sweden. Let me compare. I think there was a Swedish streamer I was talking to about this. Population of Sweden is 9.9 million. Population, let's just keep it close to home, Texas, 28.3 million. So you've got states in the U.S. that are larger than Sweden by population, and we've talked about change and how the bigger the system, the harder it is to change it, and also the more variety and diversity you have within the system.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to port models that work for a smaller system onto a much, much, much larger system.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way of putting it. Asking why, South Africa or Bangladesh or the United States or Australia doesn't adopt the Nordic political system kind of assumes that they can. And for the reasons that I've kind of outlined, they can't. And, that's not their fault. It's just the way those structural forces have evolved in those countries just does not facilitate that. It works in Minnesota. Minnesota makes it work. Minnesota has very similar culture to that region, very similar democratic political institutions, but even they don't do it exactly the same. Even there, it's much more American, much more conservative in Minnesota. But that's about as close as you could come to a Nordic political system. Every other attempt at a Nordic political system is invariably going to be an imitation. It's going to be an attempt to just hammer home that square peg through that round hole. It lacks finesse. You need to be much more organic with the approach you take to policy making if you want to adapt a political system to be relatively more like a Nordic political model. That would be the better way to go, if that is what you want to do.
Well, sweet. We're at a good stopping point. Just around 8 hours, 20 minutes for the day. Today has been fun. I know you're tired. We all have those tired days.
Very tired. That's my fault. Space empires aren't going to build themselves.
Well, of any community, I'm pretty sure we can relate to binging a game and staying up too late and being punished the next day.
Well, when you're older, it's a little more embarrassing. But yes, fair point. Fair point. Point well taken.
Well, life is short. Play some video games if you really want to.
Good advice.
Well, good.
Live your life.
Good having you on. Thanks, Fuzzy Cord, for the question handling, and thank you, chat, for giving us some cool questions to tackle.
Yeah, thank you all very much. Thank you for having me on. Always fun. Thank you, chat, for participating. You know, always good stuff.
Yep, this will be episode 34. It should be on YouTube pretty soon. I'll highlight it probably tonight, so if you wanted to watch it right away, it'll be on Twitch, and then in a day or two, it'll be on YouTube. But thanks for hanging out with us, with Agent Smith.
Yep, have a good night.
You too. Memes.